for annually inspected firms, 6 months sooner than reports have been released in recent years, thanks to the hard work of our staff. In the reports, staff identified small signs of movement in the right direction. Namely, when we look at the U.S. Big Four firms, which collectively audit approximately 80% of the market capitalization, their aggregate Part 1A deficiency rate appears to be leveling off. Still, I want to be very clear. Overall deficiency rates remain unacceptable and firms must do better. Now is the time to double down on efforts to improve and deliver the audit quality that investors deserve. As you know, part of how we enhance our inspections and improve audit quality is by increasing transparency. Making our report findings public is one of the most powerful tools the PCAOB has to drive audit quality improvement, and we have engaged in a deliberate effort to call attention to the rising deficiency rates and to publicly demand improvements from firms. Last year, I told you about new tools we launched on our website to help users find and compare inspection data. This year, we added new charts and graphs to make it easier for users to understand and compare data across firms. We also continue to search for new ways to bring our insights to investors, audit committees, and other stakeholders. There is no substitute for the role engaged and informed audit committees play when maintaining and improving audit quality. They are the gatekeepers on the ground, vetting and hiring auditors and overseeing their work. Audit committees are vital to the work we do at the PCAOB, and we are working to arm audit committees with even more information so they can ask tough questions on behalf of their investors and hold audit firms accountable for high-quality results. In fact, we recently sent those audit committee chairs who participated in our audit committee chair dialogues the most recent inspection report of the firm that audited the company where they serve on the audit committee. I look forward to today's presentation on this important topic. I'm also glad there's a discussion today on cybersecurity, which is a focus area for our inspections. Cybersecurity threats are among the greatest risks to many businesses in today's world, and audit firms are particularly attractive targets. A cybersecurity event at an issuer or broker-dealer may impact the auditor's risk assessment and related audit response. I believe today's presentation will be critical to understanding more about this topic. Finally, with respect to the third pillar of our strategic plan, we continue to work to hold bad actors accountable through strong enforcement. Earlier this spring, I told you about the largest civil penalty in the history of the PCAOB, a $25 million fine against KPMG Netherlands for violations of PCAOB rules and quality control standards related to exam cheating and misinforming investigators. We set a record in 2022, we broke that record in 2023, and we broke that record just 4 months into 2024. As of this month, the PCAOB has imposed approximately $35 million in penalties in 2024, and the year isn't over. To be clear, the cases that we brought involve serious matters that put investors at risk. Audit failures in cases involving financial statement fraud, taking on client work that firms can't complete, altering work papers, and not performing sufficient work. We have sent a clear message warning those who break the rules. If you put investors at risk, there will be consequences. 2024 has been an incredibly busy year for PCAOB as we work to enhance our investors' inspections. And none of this work would be possible without the expertise, dedication, and hard work of our incredible PCAOB staff. So I want to thank all our PCAOB staff and all of you as IAG members for sharing your thoughts, insights, and perspectives with us. Before closing, I'd like to also point out, ahead of the discussion today on emerging issues in audit firm ownership structures and funding arrangements, that the PCAOB is particularly interested in this area, including specifically the effect of these structures on audit quality, the potential risk to auditor independence, and the effect, if any, on audit firm consolidation. As such, I've asked Board Member Bodick and his team to lead a project to research these developments and advise the board on potential issues they may pose. I look forward to a robust discussion.
With that, I will say if you could please don't do as I just did. If you could please turn off your mics, that would be great. I'll now turn it over to PCAOB Chief Auditor Bob Vanich and Deputy General Counsel Connor Rasu to provide an update on PCAOB standard setting and rulemaking activity.
Thank you, Saba, and good morning, everyone. I need to pass along the regrets from my colleague, Connor Rasu, who unfortunately was not able to join us in person today, but I believe he is online, so if you have any tough questions, please direct them to him. I've also been asked to give a reminder for those of you who are joining us online, if you could please make sure you're on mute. People on the webcast are hearing some background noise. One more housekeeping update. I too need to give the disclaimer that my remarks are made in my professional capacity as Chief Auditor and represent only my views, not necessarily views of the board, its members, or other PCAOB staff. If you could advance the slide, please. One more. So again, I thought I would just spend a few minutes this morning updating you on the standard setting activities of the board and the other activities of the Office of the Chief Auditor since your last meeting. And that will include updates on the standard setting agenda. We've issued a proposal, and we've also made several recommendations, several standards final. Slide, please. So since you last met, we added 2 projects on interim standards to the short-term agenda, inventory and other reporting. Inventory would amend or replace the interim standard on auditing inventories, much as the name suggests. We discussed inventory with our advisory group last fall, our Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group, that is. The other reporting project would consider updates to several interim standards that address a variety of less common reporting situations or special reports required by the Securities and Exchange Commission, and would also address departures from an unqualified opinion. We anticipate making a recommendation to the board for proposal on other reporting in 2024 and on inventory in 2025. And we continue to make progress on other standards on our short-term standard setting agenda, including firm and engagement metrics, non-compliance with illegal acts, non-compliance with laws and regulations, and going concern. We expect to provide the board a recommendation to adopt a new standard on non-compliance with illegal acts before the end of the year. We added 1 project on an interim standard to the midterm agenda, and that is a project on internal audit, which would amend or replace the board's existing standard when an auditor uses the work of internal audit. And we discussed that standard with the Standards and Emerging Issues Advisory Group last May. In addition, our work on our research projects, data and technology, and the communication of critical audit matters continues. As part of our data and technology project, in July, our office issued a staff spotlight that summarized the outreach activities related to the integration of generative AI in audits and in financial reporting. And the spotlight shares observations related to limited outreach, I'll say, conducted by the staff. And although it was limited, we did connect with all of the U.S. global network firms and several U.S. non-affiliated firms that audit more than 100 issuers. Collectively, those firms would audit the majority of market capitalization. As noted in the spotlight, the current integration of Gen AI and audits conducted by firms that we spoke to appears to be focused primarily on administrative and research activities. However, most firms we connected with noted the potential for using generative AI in certain aspects of planning and performing the audit, and I do anticipate those changes will come very, very quickly. Firms also reported they continue to invest in Gen AI-enabled tools while also acknowledging the limitations of Gen AI at present and the need for strong supervision of its use to guard against risks such as data privacy and security. As it pertains to public company preparers, the staff are always interested in what they are doing, as auditors can control what tools they roll out but can't control what tools their clients choose to use. Preparers generally, we heard, are still exploring opportunities to incorporate Gen AI into accounting and financial reporting processes, but appears to be secondary to integrating the technology into operational and customer-facing areas. Again, the research that we conducted was limited to a small number of firms and some large issuers. We're always interested in hearing more, and so if any of you have use cases or stories that you'd like to share with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. In addition, we also now turn our attention, at least in the Office of the Chief Auditor, to thinking about how to support firms as they implement the significant number of new standards issued by the board. And we posted, just to help firms learn, a knowledge check on AS1000, which is a self-grading quiz that's available publicly on our website to help people get ready to implement that standard, which I'll talk about in a little more detail soon. If you could advance the slide, please. So since your last meeting, we issued one proposal, and that was a proposal on substantive analytical procedures back in mid-June. A substantive analytical procedure is when the auditor develops an expectation or a ratio to compare to the amount recorded by the company, and has been around for a long time, but the standard, like other interim standards, has not been updated, and it doesn't reflect developments in, for example, technology tools that can now be used to develop a much more precise expectation than in previous years. We received 23 comment letters, including one from the IG, for which we thank you. We are currently analyzing those and hope to make a recommendation to the board in the new year. Please advance the slide. So now I want to move to the discussion of the recently completed projects, and there are 4 that we're going to touch on. They're listed on the slide. I know that we had briefings made available to some of you, and I appreciate your attendance, so I won't get into too much detail, but I'm certainly happy to answer questions. And so let's start briefly with AS1000. Please advance the slide. So the AS1000 project combines several interim standards that address general responsibilities for the auditor in an audit. It includes very important concepts like due professional care, professional skepticism, and independence. The new standard reminds auditors of their obligations, including to the users of the financial statements like yourselves. What this update has in common is that it does addresses the general responsibilities of the auditor, but also provides more specificity, specifically with the engagement partners' requirements. And the one change that is a change to existing requirements is the documentation completion date. So I'll just touch on, before moving on, the documentation completion date. That has been changed from 45 days after report issuance to 14 days. We believe that that is something that can be done. If you would advance the slide, please. We did, however, choose to give smaller firms an additional year to implement that change, as it might not be as easy for them as for the larger firms. You can advance the slide, please. So moving on to QC1000, our new quality control standard. It's a significant rulemaking and is really the foundation of the audit practice for every firm. And the new standard will have an effect on all firms that are registered with the PCAOB, even those that currently do not perform audits. The current PCAOB QC standards are based on the higher level principles and do not directly address significant developments since they were issued, including the developments of networks, the use of other participants in audits, the size and complex structure of the larger firms. And so QC1000 sets forth to address those. It is a risk-based standard and sets forth quality objectives for various components of the system, and also specifies some specified quality responses. As you may know, before we issued the standard, the IAASB and ASB issued their own quality control standards. And while good news for firms is that they can leverage the work they've already done and the improvements they've already made to comply with those requirements, QC1000 does have alternative and incremental procedures that we designed to better serve investors in the public interest. For example, we have incremental procedures for firm governance of the larger firms. more specific requirements for monitoring and remediation and for the evaluation of the QC system, an ethics and independence component, which is in QC 1000, as of course would be aligned with PCAOB and SEC independence requirements. More specific provisions addressing the firm's use of technology when establishing quality objectives, and also a provision related to external communications of firm level and engagement level information that would include voluntary metrics, that information be accurate and not misleading. QC 1000 also makes a distinction between firms that are simply registered with the PCAOB and those that are actually performing audits. For firms that are registered, they will be required to design a QC system that complies with the new standard. And for firms conducting audits, they will need to both design and operate an effective system of quality control. If you would advance the slide, please. The effective date is as of December 15th, 2025. And as I mentioned, the staff is thinking about what we can do to assist firms in their implementation of the new standard. If you would advance the slide again. So I'll just touch briefly on the amendments related to aspects of designing and performing audit procedures that involve technology-assisted analysis of information in electronic form, which I'll just call the technology amendments, since that's quite a mouthful. But we issued those amendments. It was really a first step and in response to some research we had done in the past that in part answered some questions about how the standards apply when you use data-assisted analysis in an audit, but also to add some guardrails when firms use that. And so that resulted in amending the audit evidence standard and also our audit response standard. It clarified, if you would advance the slide, please. It clarified what a test of details is, and also had special considerations for the auditor's investigations identified when using data analysis to perform test of details. It also addresses when the auditor obtains information, external information from a company in electronic form, and focuses on the importance of IT general controls. When an auditor will use that information as audit evidence, we think it's important that the auditor is making sure that that information has not been subject to manipulation. The effective date for those amendments will be for fiscal years beginning on or after December 15th, 2025. You can advance the slide, please. And the last rulemaking I'll touch on is the board's new rule, PCAOB Rule 3502, contributory liability, and that rule will be effective 10/19/24, I believe, is the 60 days after SEC approval. That project updated a 20-year-old rule, and the new rule will enable the PCAOB to hold associated persons accountable when they negligently, directly, and substantially contribute to a firm's violations. And that is quite a change from the existing rule today, where the standard is negligence. You can advance the slide, please. The last standard I wanted to touch on was one that the board started and finished during their tenure, and we appreciate your comment letters and your input on this standard, which is a very important one as it affects almost all audits. But the auditor's use of confirmation standard became effective for fiscal years ending on or after June 15th, 2025, so is effective now. The staff, in support of auditors adopting the standard, developed a training which has been rolled out as part of our small business forums and is also archived online so that firms can access that. With that, I'll pause to see if anyone has any questions or comments. And if you don't want to ask now, I'll be around all day and happy to talk.
Thank you, Barb. Any questions for Barb?
I don't have, Yeah, I don't have a question. I just wanted, this is my first meeting here. I just wanted to applaud the group. I've been reading and watching what this organization has been doing over the last few months that I've been involved. And I just want to applaud you for getting things done and over the transom with a number of approvals and getting through the various Big Four and their comments and challenges, as well as obviously the SEC. So I just want to thank you.
I too applaud that you've been getting things done. What has been the company response to the list? So basically, how have companies been responding? What have they been saying? Have they actually communicated any special challenges whatsoever?
So that's a good question, and let me kind of think through that by project. Companies are more interested in some projects than others. And so, for example, we didn't get as many comments from companies on quality control as we did from auditors and investors. We also did not get significant comment from companies on substantive analytical procedures, on the data amendments, or on firm and engagement metrics, and I believe also not on firm reporting, which was put out back in April. We did get significant comments from companies on non-compliance with laws and regulations, and I know we've had briefings on that with the IAG, and we also had companies represented when we had the staff-hosted roundtable. And comments they expressed there were concerns, I think, about the potential volume of work, concerns about auditors duplicating efforts that the company already did. They gave us information on the number of laws and regulations that they comply with and the number of people they have involved in compliance functions. So I would say that that's the one project where companies weighed in more heavily maybe than on others.
Sandy?
Yeah, I had a similar question in the same vein as James on, I noticed, in NOCLAR, there were a lot of companies and audit committees that responded, but on firm and engagement reporting metrics, there were no audit committee respondents. I think there was one from Tapestry, and there were no company respondents. So would one assume that they had less concern about those things? I mean, because particularly given that they would help or seemingly help the audit committee. Yeah. I don't know if you've heard anything on that.
Not directly, but the Center for Audit Quality did submit a survey that included some responses by auditors from investors and audit committee members on firm and engagement metrics.
Oh, I don't think I saw that one. I saw the one on NOCLAR, but not that one. I'll have to look that up. Thank you.
I also see David Pitt Watson's hand up. He's virtual. David is on mute. Could you please unmute him? Maybe, David, if you could please put your question in the chat box, and we'll try to address it. I don't see David's question even in the chat box, so maybe we can. We can just move on. Sorry, David. We'll try to address your question later today. Barb is here. Thank you, Barb. Thank you, Connor. Next, IAG member James Andrus will lead a conversation regarding Audit Committee's engagement with investors. He is joined by Natasha Landell-Mills virtually, Pam Perzik, and Theo Bunting. So with that, we'll give James, Pam, and Theo a minute and begin the next panel. Thank you. James, take it away.
Thank you very much, Saba, as we get set up here. Good morning, PCAOB members, IEG members, and guests. Thank you for joining us today for this important panel discussion on audit committee-related engagement with investors. My name is James Andrus, Vice President, Public Policy, Franklin Templeton, and an IEG member. I'm delighted to moderate this session with such a distinguished group of experts. In today's rapidly evolving financial landscape, the role of audit committees has never been more critical. Effective communication between audit committees and investors is essential for fostering transparency, trust, and confidence in financial reporting. However, despite its importance, this communication often faces challenges and gaps that need to be addressed in order to enhance system effectiveness. Our goal today is to examine the current state of play and explore strategies and best practices for improving these communications. We will discuss how audit committees can better articulate their oversight roles, the importance of clear and timely disclosures, and ways to engage more effectively with investors. We are fortunate to have with us a panel of esteemed professionals who bring a wealth of experience and insights to this topic. Our panelists include Natasha Landell-Mills. Natasha will join us on screen from the UK. We have in person Pam Perezic and Theo Bunting. Natasha is a partner and head of stewardship at Saracen Partners. She's a longstanding advocate for high quality and accountable auditing. She has led several investor initiatives to call for audit market reform, and she has also led company-specific engagements. Natasha is a former member of the FRC's Investment Advisory Group, advisory board member to UK government's Audit Market Review, and currently a member of the IAASB Stakeholder Advisory Council and ICGN's Financial Capital Committee. Pam is a managing director at Kroll and leads the financial investigations practice for North America. She has a legal, accounting, and SEC enforcement background. She has served as audit committee chair for 5 boards, including nonprofit, foundation, and public company boards. She has led numerous audit committee investigations and previously served as a forensic specialist to audit engagement teams at KPMG. Our last panelist is Theo Bunting. Prior to retiring in 2017, Theo served as group president of Entergy Corporation's utility operations. Before his operations role, Theo served as senior vice president and chief accounting officer for Entergy and its subsidiaries. He began his professional career in public accounting with Arthur Andersen. Theo currently serves on boards of Unum Group, NiSource, the Hanover Insurance Group, NABA Inc., and Packlet Milliken. He chairs the audit committees of Unum Group and NiSource. As you can see, we have an excellent panel for this particular discussion. In today's discussion, I will give each panelist an opportunity to share initial insights. We will then address the current state of investor engagement with audit committees. Then we will turn to focus on what audit committees can do, and finally discuss how we might improve information sharing. I will then open up questioning from board members and IAG members. But please know that we will entertain any burning questions you may have along the way. And for this discussion, we will have time and do look forward to getting the views of IAG members. First, we will focus on the panel, and I will turn to Pam to share her initial views.
Thank you very much, James, and good day, everyone. Pleased to be here this morning with you. Maybe you can hear me better now. Thank you. Okay, so James has asked me to just sort of lead off with a discussion of the principal responsibilities of audit committees, which I'm sure many of you are well aware. I might have some views that impact some of your current considerations of audit committee communications with investors that I'll sort of add to my introductory remarks, really to just set the table here for our discussion today. So the principal mandate of the Audit Committee, as you know, is oversight of financial reporting and audit quality. With respect to financial reporting, it is imperative for Audit Committee members, and the chairs in particular, to make sure that there are sufficient disclosures around material issues, to make sure that management has done its work, making sure that the numbers tick and tie, that they make sense, that material information is reported, so that investors and other stakeholders can make informed decisions. With respect to audit quality, of course, the Audit Committee is responsible for engagement of the auditors, for having conversations with the auditors about critical audit matters, for understanding the staffing and timing of the audit and planned procedures, understanding internal control, escalating any issues that arise, and making sure that there are appropriate escalation procedures in place. It's important to note here that the Audit Committee also has other important responsibilities that are typically set forth in its charter, and those include, and I think very relevant for our discussion on this panel, they include consideration and resolution of conflicts of interest. They also include leading, conducting, and overseeing investigations into allegations of fraud and misconduct or any financial impropriety. And they also include responsibility for oversight of risk management. And that includes identification of key risks to the business and the steps that management is taking to mitigate those risks. The work of the Audit Committee and these types of matters in particular is highly confidential, and it's usually not apparent to investors and other stakeholders because of the sensitivity of that work, and also because of the board members' obligations to maintain the confidentiality of those sensitive matters and to not disclose them until such time as it may be appropriate for a public disclosure, especially in the event of an investigation or any matter involving potential misconduct. And I know we'll talk about that more today in the context of the proposal by the PCAOB to provide greater reporting and also potential audit disclosures. But I just wanted to provide that context for our framework today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam. Next, I will turn to Theo. Would you share some initial thoughts from the view of an Audit Committee chair?
Sure, James. Thanks. Thanks, everyone, for allowing me an opportunity to come and visit, speak with you today, and hopefully share some information and have a good dialogue. Pam has covered all the things that I'm responsible for. But let me maybe talk a little bit about my background first. James mentioned my role as a chief accounting officer. I've also served as a chief financial officer for various business units. I spent pretty much my entire career in the finance organization. I started with a utility company I worked for 34 years as a staff accountant, and worked my way up through the organization and has been involved in pretty much every area of accounting in most companies. So, and I was actually in a leadership role in accounting in a finance organization when Sarbanes-Oxley came, and when we had the issues with Enron and WorldCom. So I have been able to observe the financial ecosystem before and after Sarbanes-Oxley, and I've been able to see the changes and the improvements that have been made as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley. And the reason I talk to that, I think, is because when you look at the composition of audit committees today and audit committee chairs and their backgrounds, I think most of us, I don't want to give my age, but most of us came through a period where we saw that transformation, and we saw how important it was for that transformation to take place. And I think that requires of us to take the responsibilities we have as audit committee chairs and audit committee members very seriously, to protect the people that we represent on the board, which is the folks, as I always say, the people that own the companies, the investors, and make sure we are, providing the amount of time, the quality of work to protect their investments. With that being said, if you've ever looked at an audit committee charter, you will see the role of audit committees is fairly expansive, and it continues to evolve over time. We continue to deal with emerging risk issues, the evolution of the businesses that we perform our work for as audit committee members and audit committee chairs also. But what I'd really like to do is maybe talk about maybe 5 key areas. Again, Pam has mentioned some of these that audit committees focus on. These are at a high level, these areas, but there are many activities that take place, many tasks that audit committees perform as it relates to these specific areas. First, I'll use the word oversight a lot because, that is the primary function of audit committees is to provide oversight. Oversight of the external auditors, oversight of the integrity of financial statements and the related disclosures, and the effectiveness of internal controls within the company's internal control framework, oversight of the internal audit function, oversight of risk management, and oversight of one that Pam didn't mention, I believe, compliance, regulatory and legal compliance. So when you look at the totality of the work of audit committees, most of it really rolls up into those 5 key areas. And I think as most of us know, we are seeing change and transition and evolution in those areas. Technology changes the focus. When you talk about, risk management and enterprise risk, I think it's the audit committee's role in that is critical, not only from an oversight perspective as it relates to, does the company have a rigorous enterprise risk management framework, structure, process, but also there are certain risks within that framework that the audit committee has to pay specific attention to. As we go forward, I'll probably talk in more details about some of the specific activities of audit committees, but I'll give you a couple of points of reference. Publicly traded companies, their audit committee charters have to appear and have to be public, and they are generally on most companies' websites. And when I think about how audit committees should function, it begins with their charter. That charter defines the responsibilities of an audit committee. And audit committee chairs, like myself, I think work very hard to ensure that the agendas, the calendars of audit committees align with that charter, and that we are, in effect, carrying out the role, the responsibilities that are required of that charter. It's important that that charter stay current, that it's refreshed. As part of most audit committees, they review and approve their charter every year. One thing that I typically do is I benchmark charters to make sure that we are not missing something in terms of the roles and responsibilities that are evolving over time. So with that, I will stop because I think I'm past my 5 minutes, James. But I look forward to our dialogue today.
Into more detail in terms of what the audit committee actually communicates when it focuses on the public charter as well. But now we will turn to Natasha. I had the pleasure of meeting Natasha many years ago while working as an investor in attempting to engage with audit committees and with regard to the work of auditors. So I'm looking forward to hearing you with the investor side, Natasha. So please share your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Because I know
Yes.
we've got some issues.
Yes, you're coming in well.
Thank you also, James, for that introduction. I would try and be reasonably short and concise. But as James says, I'm very much coming from an investor perspective. My background has been both at an asset management firm where I am now, but also at an asset owner, a large pension scheme in the UK. And so I really take a long-term investor perspective when it comes to accounting and audit. And it probably doesn't need me to say this, but from my perspective, and I think from an investor's perspective, audit is absolutely critical. It's mission critical for investor protection, clearly, but also it's absolutely critical for the effective and efficient functioning of the overall market. And so having an effective and robust governance and oversight system of the accounting and audit processes is also mission critical. And in the end, I think in all of our long-term interests. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about investors, but I'm also actually talking about the companies themselves. I'm talking about auditors who are an incredible profession, and I'm talking about the public interest. So having an effective oversight and governance system, I think, is key. Now, I will be generalizing because not every audit and audit committee have issues. But from where I sit, at a macro level, there are concerns, and the system is not working as effectively as it could or should do. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. And I guess if I needed to point to evidence for it, I think you could look in the US at the PCAOB's own inspection reports. I was actually having a glance at, for example, the latest report on PwC for the US, where I think 18% of those inspected audits had serious deficiencies. Now, this is not unique. I think that's true of other audit firms, but it's also true internationally, globally, where IFIA presents annual reviews of high levels of deficiencies in the audit process. So against that backdrop, I think I would point to 4 key areas of concern from where I sit. It would be fabulous to get better disclosure. I know this has been a topic for the PCAOB for many years, but better disclosure from auditors through their CAMs, more meaningful CAM disclosures. I think in Europe and the UK, you do have generally fuller disclosures when it comes to critical audit matters, and to see that for US listed entities would be extremely helpful. Secondly, I think there could be much more detailed disclosures from, in fact, the audit committees. I agree wholeheartedly with what Theo was saying earlier around the importance of the charter, etc. When I look at the statutory disclosure from audit committees to shareholders, as in the proxy reports, not generally in the 10K, and they are quite short, and they don't particularly go into details on, for example, what the audit committee had focused on over the last year, what discussions the audit committee had sought with shareholders and investors to understand investors' perspective and concerns. That kind of thing would be incredibly helpful. And I think fill the gap, which is my third point, that we have globally, including in the US, in the governance framework, which is shareholder oversight. Shareholders get a vote on the reappointment of the auditor and the reappointment of audit committee directors. And so they have a really important role in holding both or all of those players to account, but also doing their own due diligence and making sure that they are looking at the accounts, looking at the audit, whether they are satisfied with that or not. And I think overall, that's not happening. And an indicator for that is extremely high levels of support repeatedly for auditor reappointments and audit committee, above 99% pretty much every single year, irrespective of whether issues have been identified or not. And I don't think that's healthy, ultimately, for any of these different stakeholders. I think a better system of accountability where shareholders actually do their homework and play their part in governance would be a good thing to see. And finally, the proxy agencies. Again, in preparation for this panel, I just had a quick look at a report from one of the large proxy agencies and the analysis that they undertook to support their recommended vote on the reappointment of the auditor as well as the audit committee. And there was really nothing there. It was very boilerplate. And again, that just fuels this problem of a lack of robust oversight and discussion with audit committees and auditors. So I expect I'm going over my time as well, James, but I just wanted to lay that out. I think all of these are very solvable, by the way. I think actually many of them exist partly because they haven't really come under the spotlight before. But I think that's a mistake. I think that's a problem because I think it weakens the entire system. So I think, as I say, it is in all of our interests to get shareholders more engaged in this topic, using their votes, audit committees seeking out shareholder opinions, having those conversations, and indeed auditors doing likewise. So with that, I will hand back over to you, James. Thank you.
Much appreciated, Natasha, but I want to stick with you for a moment. Given you're an expert in this area, and I think you articulated a number of things, but what do we see from the average investor? How do you see the average investor typically engaging with audit committees? What's happening within the market?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think I would just take you back to my point on shareholder absenteeism, to be honest. I think the average investor is not engaging with the audit process or with audit committees. And just anecdotally, from my experience, where we reach out to US boards and we ask for a meeting with the audit committee chair, which we do, most often we get, looks like we've just landed from Mars, if I can put it that way. It's not a common thing for these companies to be asked. And then generally speaking, we've been denied that access. Again, look, there will be boards, I'm sure, which will provide that access very happily, but this is seen to be quite out of the ordinary.
Yes, Sandy?
I just wanted to, I would echo everything that Natasha said. And I think in CFA Institute's comment letter on the firm and engagement performance metrics, we highlight exactly what investors see. We picked four of the largest clients of the big four and included in an attachment what have actually investors see of the audit. I didn't include the audit committee charter. Maybe that was remiss, but I think each one of them mentions it. And it is really shocking, as Natasha said, how high the vote is for the auditor and for the audit committee, given how little information investors have. I also included some of the information from the proxy advisory services and even CII on sort of their principles for voting. But even the principles for voting are based on information that investors don't have, or they only have on an ex post basis, right? So it's a real challenge, but as Natasha points out, one of the real challenges in the US market is that when we talk about the retail investor, most American corporations are owned by 5 companies, right? They're passive funds. It's BlackRock, Fidelity, Vanguard. And the voting, and now they're working on pass-through voting, but generally they're not voted, so they're not necessarily paying, or they're not, individual investors are not necessarily paying attention to it. The asset purchaser is, in some cases, voting for it. But what my experience has been in my position in this last, I guess, decade is that the move to passive investing has really created a lack of the degree of portfolio manager involvement in it, not entirely, okay? And a huge, what was the proxy voting and is now the stewardship, and they're engaged in that voting, but really, when you look at it, they don't have a lot of information. And I think that the push that investors have asked for is for more information so that they don't look foolish when they do 99%. And we included an example in our letter on GE after they had a series of restatements and DOJ issues, and they still got a 65% vote. But the audit committee rightly said that's not enough, right? And switched auditors. But it's on an ex post basis, right? And I think that the challenge of investors being more active is that they just don't simply have enough information. So more of a comment than a question, but it's really, I don't think the people who are on the audit committees or who are the auditors really switch seats and say, what am I giving these people, and what do they have to vote with? Mm-hmm. They don't look at it necessarily from the other person's perspective.
Thank you very much. And Sandy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, the other Sandy.
Yeah.
Sandy actually got ahead of me on the passive nature of 50% of most investments are held through passive accounts. Therefore, you're not going to get a lot of engagement. I'm interested in if there's any difference in the nature of the FD regulations in this country and in Europe. Are there differences in engagement? Because Reg FD is a very harsh penalty for leaking any information which is not broadly shared, therefore is I think a reasonable cap on the amount of information that any individual would offer a visitor to their office. An audit committee chair is going to be reluctant to even visit with an investor. As an audit committee chair, I've got good lawyers who tell me, don't do it. I'm interested in how that affects us.
So let me maybe respond to that as an current audit committee chair. I think it's really a question of what is the information that folks would like to engage audit committee chairs about. Would I be willing to speak with investors? Yes. But there is, your comment about Reg FD is important in terms of, what would be the substance of that communication and that conversation, what could be talked about. Companies today, board members, generally engage with investors through their compensation committee or governance chairs. Most companies today actually engage with their top shareholders, their top investors. And those generally would like to speak with the chair of the comp committee, maybe the chair of the governance committee. I did some research myself and went back and asked the companies that I chair audit committees of, has any investor ever requested a meeting with an audit committee chair? The answer was no. Now, and I hear the comments that we should be maybe more proactive and seek out to talk with investors. I'll take that and think about that and think, how does that engagement take place and how does it play out? But, someone mentioned 10K disclosure. I think actually audit committee reports and governance information is in the proxy statement. And I'm not certain, there could be certain amounts within the K itself, but generally that's by reference from the K to the proxy statement. As I said earlier, the 5 areas I talked about were kind of key focus areas. There are a number. If you look at an audit committee charter, there are generally 30 to 40 responsibilities within the context of that charter that support those 5 key areas. What we do as audit committee members, in terms of how we go about carrying out those responsibilities, I would have no issue having a conversation with investors about what we do and how we do it. In terms of the content of some of those conversations themselves, some of that, as Pam said, is done under confidentiality. There are many audit committees deal with ethical issues. They deal with internal control issues. and there's sensitivity around many areas that they focus on. But, you know, I would agree that historically boards have engagement with investors is something that, you know, as Sandy said, his lawyer would say, don't do that. And, you know, I wouldn't disagree that that might be the advice of some companies. But, you know, I think it's important, and I said this at Deloitte's accounting audit committee symposium a year ago. It's important, I think, for audit committees to tell their story, and so that folks understand the breadth and the depth of the work that they do. Because as an audit committee chair, one of your biggest challenges is trying to prioritize and also, you know, make sure you're effective as you deal with the breadth and depth of the responsibilities that audit committees have today.
Yeah, so I'm going to chime in and say that I certainly appreciate the need for there to be some transparency about the functions of audit committees. But like Sandy and like Theo, I personally have some reservations about communications with investors. Unless it's scripted, approved by council, presented at an annual meeting or an investor call. For a number of reasons. I mean, one, the last thing you want to have is like disparity in who you're speaking with. Are you speaking to institutional investors, not talking to about the few, they may be other constituents. And the board does have a fiduciary responsibility to all constituents, right? Investors, creditors, you know, secures, other stakeholders as well. So I think that whatever the communications are, they need to be broadly disseminated. I think this is a place where PCAOB could, you know, put out information for investors on those functions, but there's also potential liability issues. I mean, one, because of the sensitive nature of the communications, which Theo has talked about, that I talked about in my introduction, but also, ultimately, audit committee members have tremendous accountability because we are responsible for the integrity of the financial reporting, and if they are not correct, the audit committee members in particular are directly, you know, impacted, right? Because where were the auditors? Where were the audit committees? You know, those are areas where I think we have to think about, you know, what is the potential chilling effect of having, you know, qualified audit committee members serve? Because if you've got investors out there listening to, okay, Theo, you said you were doing this, this, and this, but, you know, there was, you know, an error in this reserve account, and you didn't catch it, and your auditors didn't catch it, and you were responsible for overseeing your auditors, it's just sort of adding fodder to the plaintiff's, you know, activist bar or others and getting that unwanted attention. So, I mean, of course, we are very thoughtful and deliberate about our communications. We do everything in our power to make sure those financial statements are accurate, that we do have sufficient disclosures, that the auditors are doing what they should be doing, that they're considering critical audit matters. But on the other hand, most of what we do, I mean, the substance, we just can't talk about, right? We can't say that we had a whistleblower complaint alleging XYZ and it proved to be false. What we can say is if we find something that we have investigated, we've taken the following remedial measures, and that can be part of a communication campaign. But I just think that it's a really sensitive area, and there's quite a lot of considerations to take into account.
Thank you, Pam. Yes, Ken?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts. I actually tend to agree a lot with what you just said, Pamela and Sandy. I've been a CFO for over 40 years. I've been on tons of boards. I'm on 4 public audit committees now, 3 of which I chair. You know, as I go back a little bit, I'll be quick. First of all, I want to make some comments. Someone made comments about index funds. The reality is that index funds take their role very seriously because, as they've told me, they are stuck owning the company. So they have no choice but to own because of the passive nature. So they take governance very seriously. So I know when I've been CFO, I've had many, many meetings with them in their offices and with our lawyers, by the way. And so you can't just discount that index funds don't care about governance, they do. Two is, I must admit, when I get a high percentage of vote as an audit committee member, I'm very happy, so thank you for that. So I don't have a problem with high votes for that. As I go back and think about, let me get my notes here, you know, Sarbanes really made some big changes, and so I'm looking around the room here. For us, the audit committee, now you have to have people with financial expertise. That wasn't the case. I always remember Citigroup, when they got in trouble, you looked at their board, they had no one there that had any financial expertise. And by the way, I could not even be on the board as an audit committee member for a bank. It's very, very different than what I do. So I think, you know, you mentioned benchmarking. You know, honestly, many of us don't look at the charter all the time. It's done once a year, you review it with lawyers. What we do look at a lot is we do benchmark. You know, I always ask my big four, come in, because I have every relationship with all of them now. And this, by the way, it's unfortunate, it's only 4. It used to be 8 when I started. So that's just, I'm now aging myself, I know. But what I ask them to do is I ask them to benchmark, what am I looking at for my agendas? What are other companies doing for their agendas? What am I missing? What should I be focusing on? What are some of the risks? How do people look at risks? So I think that's one of the things, and when you mentioned going to Deloitte Symposium, the Big Four have symposiums. I think it would be helpful, and I've said this to George, I think it would be helpful if the PCAOB thought about doing, you know, hosting a meeting, several meetings for audit committees, and just helping us think through what are the best practices, what are we missing, what should we be focusing on, what are the current things FASB's working on, the SEC's working on, you're working on, what bothers you about what we're doing or not doing. I think you have the mantra to really be helpful, and you have, frankly, the respect of all of us to go do that, you know. So all of us do that with the Big Four, many of us do, but if you, I think, focused on that, have it, you know, couple, 3 meetings, because obviously a lot of us, is one thing. I always take a little bit of perspective, because it's always easy to hit, you know, folks, audit committees and inspections and discrepancies. But I watched when Ernst & Young, EY, said they're going to reduce the number of accounts they take on because they realize they have to improve their quality. So I would say there's a cause and effect here. One is the fact that us focusing on audit quality is really important. I do think the Big Four, and I have these meetings all the time with them, because I ask them, one of the things I ask as an audit committee member, tell me what the PCAOB has said about your, you know, inspections. I want to know about it. I want to know what the issues are. So that's one of the things I ask for, very specifically, partly because I see this organization, but also because I think it's important. So I think I do think we have to be careful that I do think many of the accounting firms are very, very cognizant of their issues, and they're working on them. And the sort of the last point, and someone said investors. I think it's very hard for audit committee members to go, how many investors? I mean, some of these companies have 30, 40 investors. I don't know how you're going to meet with them. The investors look to the management teams, and particularly the audit committee. And that was, you know, we actually appoint the auditors, as we all know. That was one of the things that was done by Sarbanes. So the investors look to the audit committee to go do that work on behalf of them. So let's not say the investors should be doing that. I mean, maybe you guys disagree with me, but that's okay. A lot of people disagree with me. But I think that's a responsibility of us audit committee members to go appoint the auditors and oversee them and oversee the accounting. So let me stop there. You know, I could go on, but anyway, those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Ken. I will turn quickly to Nemit.
So, I agree with a lot of what Ken said. I think the question for you, Pam, is as Chair Williams said, right, like the high deficiency rates that we're seeing in PCAOB inspections just does not comport with the high voting percentage for reappointment of the auditors. And again, investors just don't have much information on which to evaluate auditors. So I appreciate the point that audit committee chairs cannot have meetings with the individual investors, but if there is more disclosed in terms of how like what went into auditor selection? Was the PCAOB inspection report actually considered? I mean, that would be helpful for investors to know, right? And I don't necessarily understand what are the constraints that the audit committee faces towards disclosing information about the selection process.
Really see any, objection to disclosing information about the selection process. I think the reality is, and I think that this is highlighted very well in the 2024 PCAOB TAR report, right? Because there's so much disparity between the steps that are undertaken by audit committees and audit committee chairs. Some, I have a regulatory mindset, SEC enforcement, of course I want to know if there was any disciplinary action, any prior, deficiency in an audit, anything adverse out there about the audit engagement partner, the team. That's something that some people will look at all the time. And I think if you look at the anecdotal information that was included, there are others who have no clue. They don't even know who the PCAOB is. That's scary to me.
Yes, Gina?
Yeah, that's my point. I have a very quick comment, and to beat the same drum I beat every single time, we do need to make enforcement actions more accessible. And by that, I do not mean posting a PDF on a website. You might as well carve it in stone. It needs to be data accessible so that it simply becomes one of the measures that, and to be fair, as investors, and I sit on audit committees for investors. So, I used to be the chair of Lacera's audit committee. Now I'm on the audit committee for Cedars-Sinai. We have $3.5 billion for which we have real beneficiaries in a health system. And we have a lot to do, so we're not going to go and meet with every single company that we're invested in just by nature of the numbers. And so we do depend on proxies to be able to give us a lot of information at one go about the many, especially as pass-through voting, continues to happen. I think that one of the things that we should be able to see in a quick number and metric is number of enforcements. That should be something, and that's the thing that kind of drives me nuts, is that there are enforcement actions. They do happen, and we are not getting that data summarized in a data accessible way. And that's on us.
Thank you much, Gina. What I want to do now is turn back to Natasha, given the discussion that we've been having here, and focus as well on the U.S. side. Given there was a comment basically alluding to others may do it differently. I think when we start to talk about engagement, the first source of engagement is what are the disclosures, what are the communications with investors? And so when you look at the U.S. communication with investors, and I want to get you into it as well, Theo, in terms of, is it adequate the way the U.S. audit committee reports are written and the information that is provided? And so is it enough to say that a stakeholder who wishes to understand more can read the charter, AS-16, understands Sarbanes-Oxley, and the relevant exchange requirements and SEC regulations, and they're good to go? Or is there a need for an audit committee report to contain more information? What are your thoughts, Natasha?
Thank you, James, and also fascinating conversation there earlier. So my thoughts is that there's tremendous scope to increase disclosures. And to your point about what might be happening in other markets, certainly in the UK, Europe, the norm now actually for larger companies is to get quite detailed, particularly in the UK, quite detailed audit committee reports to shareholders, which go beyond the policies and the procedures and what they're responsible for, to talk about, these are the 3 or 4 key things that we as an audit committee focused on this year. These are the things that we did. We had training. We had really intensive discussions with the auditor on this. We asked the auditor to drill down on X, Y, and Z. So they go into their actual work program. I think one of the points that was coming out very strongly earlier was a kind of, in the background, almost a fear of the legal or regulatory risk associated with conversations with investors. I think that's a great shame, but I understand it. But it would seem to me that the best way of tackling that is through these market-wide disclosures. So the audit Committee's annual report to shareholders, outlining to them, all of the activities that they've done. In addition, it is possible maybe to consider, in the same way you get capital markets days where the senior management team will be talking to investors, you could get, a board investor day, or even better, an audit committee day. Maybe you make it half a day, given that, that's probably enough. But that would then be a public exchange of views, so you wouldn't have any question about non-public material information being shared with just certain investors or not. And it would allow a conversation, because I think the point that I'd really like to underline is this is not just getting the audit committee to share with investors. Yes, we would like that, but that's just the beginning of the conversation. The reason we need that is so that investors can then respond to that, to offer their thoughts on that. And I think that's where it becomes enriching. We're all interested in the end, I think, boards, auditors, shareholders, in making sure that we're getting the most reliable information that would then underpin long-term prosperity for that business. So the audit committee hearing from investors where they see problems with the accounts, where they're saying, that feels a little bit aggressive to me, that assumption, or I'm a little bit worried about, the approach being taken to revenue recognition over here, whatever it is. I think that would be beneficial for all sides for that communication to happen. Thank you.
What are your thoughts on that, Pam and Theo?
As I stated earlier, I do think audit committees need to do a better job of, when I say telling their story, to communicate within the context of their audit committee reports, the things, the activities, the things that they are doing. And, if you look at audit committee reports and proxy statements, there is a wide range. The gentleman that mentioned the disclosure on, what do you actually see the PCAOB reports, and do you talk about those with auditors, and do you actually say that? I see that in some audit committee reports. I see the steps that companies disclose, audit committees disclose, as to the steps they went through to make that determination as to how they view the work of the external auditors. So yes, I'll agree with the point that there is, I think the term we used to use in accounting, maybe it's not used anymore, diversity of practice when you talk about the disclosures in proxy statements. But some of that falls back on the conversation, and comments Pam made earlier, and Sandy Rich as well, in terms of, there are certain requirements that have been mandated that you disclose, and it's just a question of how much farther will companies go above and beyond that. And for some, I think you have to be very measured in terms of how far you go above and beyond that. But I do think, there's opportunity for better disclosure as it relates to the audit committee reports. In terms of what audit committees, I heard the comment about, and we had a conversation yesterday, I think we all have the same objective. I think the auditors, the audit committees, the PCAOB, the SEC, we want to ensure trust in financial markets and investors as well. And so I think that is in the forefront in thoughts of audit committee members, audit committee chairs, and the role they play in doing that. One of your PCAOB board members made a comment yesterday in a meeting I had where he talked about the audit committee setting at a great intersection point between management and investors, and that's true. They are the group that, and auditors, they are the group that get to engage with management, engage with the auditors, and there's a triangle of the three. And audit committees are not all created equal. I'll be the first to say that. There are differences. Mr. Goldman mentioned the qualifications. sit on 2 audit committees that I chair. We have 4 members, 3 members on each of those audit committees qualify as audit committee financial experts. 15, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, you may not have seen that on audit committees. So I do think there has been a change in the quality of audit committee members, and I think there has been a change in the focus. I just think we need to do a better job of telling that story in terms of who we are, what we do, and how we reach some of the conclusions we reach.
I would add to that, as much as there may need to be some transparency and disclosure about the roles and responsibilities of audit committees and audit committee chairs, it's equally important to discuss the limitations. I think we've all said there are certain issues of substance, of sensitivity that cannot be disclosed. There was just a reference to, well, what if there's a disagreement regarding a management assumption or estimate? That's not going to come out in an audit committee report, and it shouldn't. The place that that's going to come out is in a revision to the estimate or assumption. It will come out in communications amongst the audit committee and its auditors and management. And at the end of the day, the most important thing is that the end result of that process contains information that can be relied upon by investors. So just remember, like, that's the most important thing. You know, I don't want to say, you know, there has to be some level of trust that the audit committee will engage in those important conversations and those important deliberations. But you're not going to see the sausage making into, you know, the audit committee said this, the auditor pushed back. At the end of the day, you know, this is where and at the end of the day, this is where we landed. That's okay, but that's an important thing that should be disclosed to investors as well, is that a lot of thought will go in, a lot of viewpoints will be shared, a lot of expertise will be sought. If necessary, outside consultants will be brought in and consulted on thorny issues like that. But that's not the type of thing that, in my view, you know, should ever be disclosed unless there's, you know, a need for public disclosure because there has been some sort of associated result. And you might see that in the termination of a CFO. You might see it in the resignation of an audit committee chair. There will be other indicators, I think, that will provide also relevant information from investors.
Speaking of investors, Gary, let's hear from you.
Well, thank you. My question relates to the intersection that you talked about, Theo, with CAMs, and we're going to talk about CAMs later on today. What the idea was there was a rich conversation between audit committees and auditors that we thought would be a great idea to have shareholders have some exposure to that. There was the reluctance to make sure that that relationship still held, and I'm interested in, after 4 years of doing this, has there been any change between the relationship between auditors and company management?
I will speak more so. I mean, I'll speak more so in terms of change in relationship between audit committees and the auditors, and then maybe I'll address your question with management. You know, I have a firm belief there should always exist a healthy tension between the 3 groups that are in that triangle. And each one should respect the roles and the assignments or the responsibilities of the other. With CAMs, from my perspective, any change in relationship between the audit committee and the auditors, no. I have routinely scheduled meetings with the engagement partner with both of the companies who I chair the audit committees. We talk on a regular basis, and we talk about the issues, the concerns. We talk about the talent of the team. We talk about what's going on within the context of their firm, their recruitment efforts, are they able to retain talent? And so, you know, the engagement between the audit committee and the auditors, and from my perspective, goes well beyond just the meetings that are scheduled around the board. They need to, given the complexities of the issues we deal with and, the breadth of the, what the audit committees are responsible for. In terms of, have I seen a change in the relationship between management and the auditors around CAMS? No. We have the discussion around CAMS, have the discussion around CAMS with management as well as with the auditors, and I think the conversation around critical accounting matters takes place on an ongoing basis. It should, with the audit committee, management, and the auditors.
I mean, I think speaking more broadly to the relationship, Gary, between management and auditors. I mean, there has been a sea change, as I'm sure everyone knows, over the past couple of decades, to be sure. Just with respect to the degree of professional skepticism, certainly auditor rotation helped that quite a bit. I mean, I remember when I was a forensic specialist of the audit committee, we always, I remember just being shocked that the auditors would talk about management as, we. It's like, oh no. And we've come a long way from that. Now, I think what I see more of is more of an alliance between audit committee chairs and auditors, really asking hard questions and probing about assumptions and sort of having direct conversations about people, personnel, qualifications, perceptions of management and their respective capabilities and responsibilities, whether at the company there's adequate staffing, particularly in the financial reporting function, where there's adequate expertise, whether there are some gaps that might need to be filled. So that's something that I've seen more so in the last 4 to 5 years, much more open and candid conversations about critical audit matters and beyond. So that's something that I think is important. I think that's a positive development on many levels.
Thank you. Yes, Paul.
Thanks very much. This has been a really interesting discussion. I'm first just going to push back gently on something I've heard a couple of times. Asset managers don't own companies. We, asset owners, I'm a trustee of a pension fund, we actually own the companies. I mean, Mark is trying to solve a really difficult problem here, right? We have this long chain between asset owners, asset managers, auditors, audit committees, companies. I mean, I'm going to argue the system is working reasonably well, not to discourage the work that's being done, because it's necessary and it's very good, but why are index funds so big in the US capital market? Well, it's because active management, actively trying to dig into company details, doesn't really work. Sorry, James, but some of it works. Some of it works, some of it, and we should try. But I'm just saying, we are in a pretty informationally efficient market equilibrium, right? US equities, it may be very wrong, are probably never been more highly valued, both in absolute terms and relative to equity markets in the rest of the world. So again, providing good information for investors is expensive. It takes a lot of people doing a lot of work. I think the comment about audit committees competing with each other is very apt, because you companies are competing for our capital. You have an incentive to provide the best information possible. So I'm just going to say, I think the system is working. Not that everyone should continue to work like they are, because it's essential to get this information flowing, but I would just like to observe overall, things seem to be working pretty well. Thank you.
Yes, Nemeth.
I mean, I agree the system is working, but just because it's working doesn't mean it cannot be improved. And I think that's partly the conversation, right? Just picking up a little bit on what Theo said initially, I mean, the backgrounds of audit committee members is certainly, the makeup is quite different across different issuers. And in many instances, the audit committee members don't necessarily have a background in accounting and might not necessarily know the questions to ask. I combine this just with this statistic, I want to say, where it's becoming more common now for companies to release their annual earnings, to make their earnings announcements before the audit fieldwork is even complete. And I mean, that just gives the impression that there's not necessarily sufficient regard for audited financial statements. I don't know where the audit committee, how do you see this, where companies release earnings before the audit fieldwork is complete?
Just a couple of things, maybe for clarification. Interim financial statements are not audited financial statements.
No, I'm talking about annual financial statements.
Okay. Annual financial statements, I think what companies may do is do pre-releases, but I think, at the same time, there is a caveat in terms of, they will come back with a final earnings release. They view those as preliminary in nature. I think most releases of information, whether they're pre-released or, let's say we're talking the K, I want to make sure I get this right, so I want to think through the timing. I can only speak for the process that I engage in. At the time an earnings release takes place, I have probably reviewed the K at least twice as an audit committee chair, and it is substantially complete at that point in time. What your auditors will tell you is they still have a few steps to quote-unquote complete, but they have completed the lion's share of their work. Also, earnings releases, part of the role of audit committees is to engage and discuss and review with management their earnings releases and engage them and talk through not only the financial information in the release, but we also talk through the actual release narrative itself. So I guess I'll have to push back a little bit in terms of, kind of the audit, releasing information before the audit is complete. Technically, there may be a few things the auditors still need to finish up, but rest assured, as an audit committee chair, we wouldn't be releasing information if we weren't comfortable that all substantial issues around the audit had not been addressed and been tied down.
Yeah, I just want to quickly add, both the quarters are reviewed, at least the companies I'm involved in, quarters are fully reviewed by the auditors. Annual results aren't released unless they've approved them. So there may be some ticking and tacking for the K and so forth, but no, you'd be crazy to issue quarterly numbers or annual numbers that haven't been audited, well, quarterly reviewed by your auditors and annual audited. So no, I don't agree with your comment.
Actually, I had to refer you to Southwest Airlines' announcement today that they've systematically changed their annual expectations prior to any 8K, 10Q, or 10K announcement, and have dramatically impacted the market for their stock. So, I mean, the practical reality is press releases predate numbers, and press releases have a dramatic impact on investors and shareholders. I mean, I was a money manager, so, 10Ks were a follow-on to determine whether what we expected was delivered. But a company that actually is going to deliver something dramatically different from what was expected is almost always advised to get out ahead of it. Always, by their lawyers and their bankers. So I would I wanted to jump in and agree with Ken on the delegated capitalism idea. We kind of trust the layers of delegation, that they are protecting the upper layers and the lower layers are acting as they're supposed to. And I think we have to acknowledge that regulation dramatically impacts the conduits of information and what is allowed to come out, how it's allowed to come out. And even with the PCAOB, I've had conversations with them about some reports I've read that said, holy crap, does everyone know this? And, they can't say anything until the SEC finally expresses an opinion. So it's like the regulation dramatically squelches some sources of information, stimulates others, and then regulates the rest.
Can I say something?
Quickly?
So I agree with you, but I think we're conflating, like, what is it related to the audit and what's the overall audit committee responsibilities, I mean, at the PCAOB, right? So we're saying that comments have been made, well, I never get a question from investors, okay, because they know they're not going to get anything else, right? And that they know that, so that's why they don't. That's why Natasha said.
Actually, my comment was they've never inquired. I'm not sure I would say they're not going to get anything.
They know that they're not going to get anything, right? So I constantly hear that as a refrain, that investors are not interested or there's no problem, when there's nothing else to discuss because they know Reg FD exists and they're not going to get any additional information. So I don't think we can say that that's empirical evidence that there's sort of no problem, right? And the comment was made that, well, we get a lot of questions from the governance committee and on compensation. That's because they have the compensation discussion and analysis, and they don't have anything about the audit, right? That, I think, is an important fact that needs to be brought to light relative to what they have to talk about. And so what the PCAOB is trying to do when it comes to firm and engagement performance metrics is to give them something to actually have a conversation about. And while there are many layers involved in the governance process, one very important layer of that governance process is not for investors to circumvent it, but for investors to be part of that accountability process. And if they don't have information to hold people accountable, they can't do it, right? And that is why investors are advocating for information to be in the public domain and for them to ask it. Investors own the company. They're not going to ask for disclosure of public information on a whistleblower complaint, right? They're not going to ask for things that are going to hurt them, right? They own the place. And so we always go to this, we go from one extreme to the other, and what investors are simply asking for is to be able to have information to make an informed vote and decision about the audit committee and the audit. And that's what we hear, and we hear it's not working for them, right? That part of the system, maybe parts of the system are working, but that part of the system, people have said, as Natasha said, they can't have the conversation. And Natasha's point with respect to engagement with auditors was actually a part, if you read the UK audit reform and the Bryden review, and we made comments on it, that investors wanted more discussion directly with the auditor, right? So I think we take it to an extreme that investors are asking for all this information that they can't possibly provide, and that's really not the case. I think investors are asking for measured steps towards moving audit out of a credence good to be able to hold the audit committee they hire accountable. And that's, I think we sort of took it here a little bit to an extreme, and that's not really what investors are saying.
If I could just make a quick comment on that, I think it would be helpful if there are for other areas mandatory disclosures, right?
And that's what we're
what
asking
steps were
for.
taken to review the qualifications of the audit engagement team?
Right.
Was there not review of any prior significant deficiencies? That type of thing, I think that. I think that could be valuable.
Right.
Like that is something that's more in between than the extremes that make all of us audit committee chairs very, very nervous.
But that's not what investors
But something like that
asking for.
I think is fair. But I do think that there ought to be, guidance on those so that there's some uniformity in what is disclosed. And it also gives a measure of protection, with respect to the considerations that go into the selection and retention process.
Investors are asking to get the disclosures into the public domain so they don't ask a question that leads to nothing.
So,
or they
no,
don't
look.
ask the question because they know it'll lead to nothing.
Yeah, I'll follow up with Pam's comments. I totally agree. I mean, if you think about the evolution, you talk about, CDA and they ask compensation because they see the information that came about because of requirements to include that information, correct?
Absolutely.
And so, yes, as I've said, we do need to do a better job of telling our story in terms of audit committees. And so I think audit committees are open to, and audit committee chairs are open to providing more information. I think it's just a question of how far do you go? What is that information? And what information, what problem are we trying to solve, and what information will be useful to investors?
Okay. Thank you much. I want to get Natasha in again. So Natasha, we've heard that the system is working okay. but there may be a need for enhancements. I want to get you in on this particular part of the conversation. Is the system working okay? And what enhancements do you think we need?
Great, thank you. I think my starting point, as I mentioned in the introduction, is that there is definitely room for improvement from my perspective. And I referred to the inspection report results from the PCAOB as an example, with a very high, I would say, high level of serious deficiencies in audits of individual firms. And I mentioned that this is also an issue globally. This is not unique to the US. So I definitely think there is a problem, and I think it is one that's resolvable. And as I mentioned, as Sandy very articulately set out there, it's around better disclosures, better governance, and greater accountability, and that will make for a much healthier system. I did want to just pick up this point about, well, it would be, I think Pam had made it, that if there was more, if it was made mandatory, the disclosure was made mandatory. Now, I think, yes, that is one route. I guess it could take forever to come about, but hopefully that's not a requirement before audit committees disclose more. I was been very encouraged by some of Theo's comments around the fact that it could be improved, and he'd very much like to know what investors would like to see, etc. And I think that then brings in this point about dialogue with investors, right? If investors are having conversations with audit committees in safe spaces, fully public, and all of that, I think that quite a lot could be gleaned as to what investors would like to see more disclosure on. And then the audit committees can go away and consider whether that's something that they can do or whether it's something they can't do. But that then is the beginning of a conversation, which then provides a basis for accountability, which is what will make the system work better overall. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you much. And I want to go to Theo now, because you mentioned. Oh. Sorry, I didn't see it. Yes, Board Member Ho.
No problem. Thank you. And I do want to give my disclaimer before I ask my questions. The views I express here are my own, and they do not necessarily represent the PCAOB board, other board members, or staff. I want to thank you. Thank you, James, for moderating this session, and this is very informative. And thank you to the panelists for joining us. And I really appreciate your transparency and your expertise, and your commitment to audit quality is clear to me, consistent with a lot of the interaction I've had with other audit committee chairs and members. So I have two questions based on our discussion here. The first one is I want to get a better, and really these questions are specifically for Theo and Pam. And Theo, good to see you again. And is that in terms of, I want to understand a little bit more the audit committee's access to external auditors' information. Because sometimes I hear that we need to provide more information to the audit committees. And I just want to have a better understanding of the level of engagement audit committees have with external auditors, and the level of access they could have if they wanted to, whether there's any restriction. So that's the first question. And the second question I have is, as an audit committee chair or member, who have oversight of the external audit, what do you think are the top 3 areas that external auditors need standards and rules from your perspective? Thank you.
Maybe we'll do this to be efficient. I'll address your first question, and maybe I'll ask Pam to address the second question. Does that work for you? All right. So in terms of, engagement with external auditors, it's unfettered from my perspective as an audit committee chair. We engage the external auditors. As I mentioned earlier, I have recurring meetings with the lead engagement partner and at times other members from the national office as well as other members of their staff on an ongoing basis. I schedule them biweekly. Sometimes those meetings last an hour, sometimes they last 10 minutes. It depends upon, what the issues are, what are the things we have to discuss. The one area where I would say we sometimes maybe have a different point of view on and talk about is the Part 2 findings, PCAOB. As you all well know, those are confidential, and so at times having that conversation can be, I won't say challenging, but I think the firms do the best they can to try to protect that confidentiality, but at the same time be responsive to the requests, from the committee, from me as a chair. From my perspective, that engagement, and I think the understanding of the role and responsibility and the hierarchical relationship between external auditors and myself as an audit committee is pretty clear. I make it very clear. I have asked, for instance, someone from one of the firms to come to audit committee meeting and talk about audit quality within their firm from their national office. We talk about audit quality as it relates to the engagement team. I've asked for data on, this industry sector. What has been the PCAOB data for your company on my industry on this industry sector? Are you better than what I see for your firm, or worse, on your firm across the board? Because I do think there are, in some cases, differences for firms. Some firms have certain, I believe, again, maybe I'll do my disclaimer now, my opinion. I think they do have levels of expertise, potentially in certain industries, that differentiate them from other firms. And I want to see and understand that if my belief is true or not. But to answer your question, no, I've never felt that I've been not given access to information that I've requested.
Thank you for those questions, Board Member Ho. So just to touch quickly on the first, with respect to access to reports that are available, as I commented before, I think there's just a wide range of knowledge, interest, and access by audit committees and audit committee chairs. In reading the report, it's very apparent that there's a lot of information available, but there's a mix of folks who either don't review it. Some certainly do. Theo does. I do. A lot of audit committee chairs do, but there's probably an equal number that don't. And maybe some consideration should be given about whether someone can be considered a financial expert if they don't know who the PCAOB is, for example. And I'm not being facetious. I mean, really. So that's one thought I have on that. I also liked the idea. There seemed to have been sort of a request or a desire to receive sort of highlight on what were some of the current issues and how those disseminated. I like that idea. I mean, for me, I look at things that are relevant to either the industry, the auditors, the company, regulatory trends that I follow very closely, because those of us in Washington who work and live in the enforcement world live and breathe every utterance that is potentially relevant to all of the work we do for our clients, for our boards, as the case may be. But because of that large disparity, I do really like the idea of giving some thought about how some of this important work can be made more broadly available to those who don't necessarily live and breathe this world on a day-to-day basis. So turning to the more challenging second question of, where do we think the audit committee or the auditors, could benefit and be more effective? One I alluded to earlier, which is really having open and candid conversations with the audit committee and talking about the caliber of management, any weaknesses, so that it really empowers the audit committee to be in a position to help affect change in management if there is a gap. And I think if you have trust with the auditors, then you can have those candid conversations. And I think that there's probably a lot more that can be done there. I think some people, by disposition or by experience, are able to have those conversations. Others don't necessarily know the parameters as well, or appreciate just how constructive those conversations can be. Secondly, and part of this comes out of the Securities Enforcement Conference in Chicago this week, which was just fantastic and had a lot of conversation about AI. And, what is the board's oversight responsibility? What is management's responsibility? And I think that the auditors ought to be having conversations, and particularly as it relates to disclosures and the adequacy of disclosures. Are companies doing what they should be doing? And are auditors thinking about that as a disclosure issue as we look at these emerging trends and these emerging regulatory issues? So, whether it's a question of bringing in the auditor's own specialists or sometimes bringing in an external specialist to have a conversation, maybe, from the audit committee perspective or from the board perspective, maybe it's part of the annual, board education program. But from the auditor perspective, I think that those types of experts should be brought in the planning phase, to consider, are there new areas that we should be looking at this year that we haven't looked at in previous years? And I guess by lumping 2 and 3 together, it's one, the emerging regulatory risks, and then new frontiers, right? I mean, look at the implications on the supply chain, not only from COVID, but from the recent weaponization of the supply chain. What does that mean? And as you look at your own sustainability and potential disruptions to the supply chain, do we need to disclose some information about that? In our risk disclosures. I mean, how could it impact our business? Like that type of thing is new thinking, and I think that certainly within the Big Four, you'll have experts come in on a pretty regular basis and talk about current edge issues, but it varies on a firm-to-firm basis. And in the more mid-tier firms or even the smaller firms, I would virtually guarantee you have nothing like that. So, I know part of the mandate, of the PCAOB is to provide, greater education, greater tools, greater, transparency around that. And I think that's a place where I think there could be some enhancements.
So I said I wouldn't answer the second question, but I can't resist. I'm sorry. Not 3, but I'll maybe 1 or 2. I think technology, and a focus on technology. When we, from an audit committee perspective, I would tell you, 5, 10 years ago, the conversations around cyber were very small. It has grown immensely. AI is the next item. And so I think standard setting around technology, use of technology, and I think would be great. You have one in front of you now that I'm going to walk softly to talk about, NOCLAR. Is there a need for better standards around, kind of laws and regulations? Compliance is becoming a bigger part of what audit committees focus on and have to focus on. The evolution of laws and regulations, and to some extent the proliferation of them coming out, is an area that I think audit committees spend a lot of time on. So to what extent should the auditors spend more time relative to that, I think is a good question. Most of you have seen my comment letter along with others on NOCLAR. The topic itself, I think, is one that should be addressed. I think it's just a question of what should be required and how much should be required. And I think you got that response from a lot of folks in their comment letters. But for me personally, that is an area where you continue to see more and more compliance requirements placed on companies. Audit committees focus on more and more on compliance, on new laws and regulations. And you know, it is what I view as one of those risk areas where we pay a lot of attention to.
Thank you much. And if we have a quick question from Gina, and then I will give Natasha the last word.
So I'm just going to go back to Sandy's comment earlier, which I wholeheartedly agree with, and to Pam's comment. I agree, nobody wants to see the sausage being made, and I don't think that we would be able to do much with that information either. However, I also agree that voluntary compliance, or rather voluntary disclosure is not necessarily the way forward either, because to some degree you sort of hand your investors the stick they beat you with. So
Fair.
having been in the public sector, I can appreciate that. And so, you know, I think that the goal is to go by, you know, to go slowly to see what additional information we can add to the conversation. But I still go back to the fact that there are almost 4,000 reports, inspection reports currently available, digitized in PDF format, but not available in any kind of a JSONable format that we can feed into Bloomberg, feed into FactSet, and feed into the proxy statement, so that when we sit down and have our corporate governance teams arrange for the 7,000 proxy votes we're about to send out, we can't do that without at least a reasonable dashboard about where have enforcement actions taken place, what is the trajectory, and the audit committees themselves having that information would be very important when you're going through your RFP for auditor on a regular basis. And it would also be helpful to have those dashboards to know, is the audit committee functioning? Are they making progress? Are the controls working? And right now, we just don't have enough information to even dashboard that into a few simple data points. And you know, you're looking at 4,000 reports, each of which has at least 5 opinions, if not more, in terms of data points that we could be looking at. And so that's why I want to just underscore that I'm not looking to change the world here or to sort of open the kimono. I'm simply asking for the information that we have available today that would make a difference today in how we vote, and to maybe incrementally add to that.
Thank you much. And the investor will get the last word. Natasha.
I like that. Let's make that a kind of routine set of affairs. I just wanted to end on trust. Actually, I think we started out early on talking about trust and how trust is very much, you know, the thing that markets are built on and market efficiency is built on, and that's where audit comes in. I don't think a system where you get 99% plus levels of approval of auditor reappointments, audit committee directors, is one that is indicative of a healthy system that is going to generate trust. I think actually what we need to see is the importance of accounting and audit put back in the center. We need a shareholder awakening on that. We need more dialogue, we need more challenge, and we need good and best practice rewarded and failures penalized, if I can put it that way. So I think really if we're going to build trust in this system, I do think we will need to move to a better level of transparency that will enhance those conversations.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you, Pam and Theo, for an exciting panel. And thank you, IAG members, for all of your questions and your input. I pass it back to Saba.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Pam, Theo, and Natasha. We'll take a quick break and be back at 11:25 sharp. Thank you. Welcome back to today's meeting. Next, we have a presentation on audit firm ownership structures and funding arrangements, moderated by IAG member Sandy Rich, with Professor Maria Bursoff of George Mason University, and IAG members Alicia Damley and Jonathan Grable. Sandy, please take it away.
Well, thank you for those introductions, Saba, and I want to thank the board and Saba and her team for supporting our efforts to talk about this subject today. I would offer two comments before we get into questions and a conversation. First, as moderator, I reserve the right to also be an engaged panelist. I have attempted to recruit PE fund managers and accounting firm executives who have direct experience with this question, and it was difficult. But I've got a background in non-investment grade debt, investment banking, commercial banking, and investing, so I will offer some dated observations. And then also, we have to understand that this is a topic that has emerged in the last 6 to 12 months. We are very early on into what is a new venture effort from many PE funds in investing in these institutions. We may not see the ultimate answers to many of the questions we are posing for 5 to 8 years, as the cycle of a PE fund is a period of investment of 5 to 8 years and a period of liquidation. So, with that said, I would encourage the board to please engage with questions. Anyone else out there, please engage in questions, and we would intend to go through a rather structured conversation around the general nature of what's happening, the positives, the negatives, and then what I think is most important, what are the governance implications, and what should the PCAOB be thinking about in terms of how to understand what's going on and perhaps respond. So we've introduced everyone, and I will just lay out the first question. What are the motivations for PE firms investing in accounting firms? We do have CPA, CFA, Alicia, Jonathan, a owner of many of these PE funds, and I'm sure he has exposures and maybe some issues on conflicts, and Maria, who's starting to research all this stuff. So leave it open. Maria, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. I would like to thank the board and the PCAOB staff for the opportunity to be here. And I will open this conversation by saying, yes, there are many attractive characteristics of accounting industry for the private equity sector. First, this industry is highly fragmented. So currently, private equity firms, they see that as a good field to go into and potentially buy other companies as they build their strategies and gain more experience. The other characteristic is that there are stable cash flows present in that business. The audit side of the business is resilient to academic cycles. The demand is there. So that provides an attractive characteristic, also safeguards a little bit from the fluctuations on the advisory side of the business. There is an increasing demand for advanced accounting services for the firms as they become more international and more complex. So the private equity firms also see that as a very lucrative market that has a potential for growth. And finally, this was already mentioned here during the other panel, there is a lot of tech innovation that is currently happening. So I believe that both the accounting firms and the private equity firms see the accounting as a fertile ground for implementation of tech and AI and all of these advances in terms of increasing operational efficiency and just potentially improving the overall level of service that the companies can provide.
Also, I'd like to thank the board, PCAOB staff, my fellow panelists. Just in terms of, if I think about the contours of my career, I started as a CPA. I then went into investment banking, then became a general partner of a private equity firm, now as the CIO of a large pension plan. In many ways, this topic is the contours of my career. So, maybe I tap out after this discussion. I think, Sandy, when you get to the gist of the question is why now? I think that there's a lot in that question. Private equity is, a many trillion-dollar industry today. If you go back and look over the prior generations as private equity was maturing and growing from billions to tens of billions to hundreds of billions to trillions, the easy opportunities were picked over. This may not be the easiest of opportunities, which is why it's emerging in the mid-2020s as opposed to in the mid-1980s. So I think that why now, that has a lot to do with it. The easy roll-ups, the consolidations, putting aside venture, because venture always is topical as new technologies, new issues emerge. So I think a part of it is easy opportunities are picked over. Accounting in many ways is challenging. It's regulated. It doesn't necessarily have the widest margins. And with increased competition, maybe there's consolidation of margins. So I think that there are certainly challenges associated with the topic. And when I was first asked to be on this panel to have this discussion, I was at first skeptical, thinking that it's more one way than the other. I think that, and as Sandy started out by saying, we don't know, I think that my perspective is, having, given it some time, is much more nuanced. I think that there are some upsides associated with it. I think some of it was discussed in the prior panel about governance, a focus on governance, and a focus on governance expertise. I think that there's some benefits, plus and minus, from consolidation. Maybe, I started my career, Ken mentioned the Big 8. I started at a Big 6. So I think that there's the potential for consolidation. With that, potentially, is some good things. Specialization, with that, there's potentially is, as the prior panel also talked about technology and emerging audit issues. I think potential for firms to grow areas of expertise and specialization. I think the one thing, and I'll pause, where I'm still most skeptical is many of the initial benefits come from that initial private equity owner. And with an exit, to the extent the exit from that initial private equity owner is a subsequent private equity owner, and then beyond that is another private equity owner, I think at most of the economies, the goods will have been put in place by then. So I think that the real challenge comes maybe not 8 years from now, but is 15 years from now, when private equity ownership maybe goes from private equity firm to private equity firm.
Thank you, Sandy, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak on this panel. And I actually want to applaud the PCAOB board in terms of recognizing the importance of this, quite different from the perspective of usually the board is looking after a problem has happened, whereas here there's clearly an opportunity to be considering implications of a direction in what is happening within this industry, and therefore to think about the implications of that. And I think as our panel unfolds, though we appear to be in agreement on so many things right now, because I only have one additional point to add to what my esteemed panelists have mentioned, the pre-call, if I can call it that, and we had several, was quite the engaging discussion. So please do not think that we're all on the same page as we kick off this. We're trying to lead you into this gently, perhaps. The one additional point that I would make here, in addition to what has already been stated, is actually to think about demographics. I'm a thematic investor, so demographics have been a very important consideration in terms of how I think about medium-term opportunities. And where I'm coming from this angle, and I can't help but think about this when I started my career in public accounting, again with the big six, not the big eight, there was a very distinct difference between kind of the partnership layer versus me as an incoming audit associate. And 25 years later, I think it's fair to say that that partnership layer has aged and is perhaps looking for that exit strategy. And of course, in an accounting firm, it's either drawings on an ongoing basis, but there's no other logical way in terms of selling your shares or what have you, right? I think the typical structure is to pass that down through the firm and have some form of ongoing pension or drawings benefit. So I can't help but wonder whether, given some of the challenges that the profession has been having that we've all been reading about, whether this isn't very timely in terms of the kind of capital that may be required in order to facilitate this transaction. I don't know how it's going to unfold, but I wonder how much that plays a role in the current process.
So just to tie in a couple of things, and sticking with you, Alicia, because of your CFA background, Maria spoke about the stability of auditing cash flows. And one of the interesting things about the Grant Thornton acquisition is they've separated their attestation operation from their non-attest operation, and they're operating them separately. The idea that stable revenues makes me think of software revenues, makes me think of license versus software as a service revenues and the difference in the valuation. Do you think there's a bridge there that private equity investors are thinking about when they're thinking about exits?
I would be. As an investor, I definitely would be, right? I can value an annuitizing business with relative ease when I have some consistency around expectation, whether that is volume, whether that is growth, what it might be connected to, and of course the opportunity in terms of making that pie bigger versus how it's evolving. So that piece of the business has a very interesting and persuasive profile with respect to how it could fit in a broader portfolio. The advisory side of the business, of course, is quite different. And in a way, they're almost like a natural fit because you've got this consistent assurance practice with presumably stable revenue profile with an advisory business which is non-recurring, right? I think every time you've landed that first engagement, you're thinking about the next one because this engagement's going to come to an end. So you've got that volatility, if I can use that term. Now, up until now, all of these firms have grown these businesses to a phenomenal level. And the question becomes, perhaps where do they go from here? The reputational risks and what the implications on that is in terms of the growth of that side of the business. So from the PE perspective, I've got opportunity in terms of earnings stability, if I can use that term very broadly. And this other side of the business where is there some restructuring that's necessary? Is there a way to stabilize the revenue stream? Is it more important to manage expenses on that front as a result? Have we maxed out the kind of incredible growth that these firms have managed to generate over the past 20 plus years as they've grown these businesses from nothing to the magnitudes that they are?
So, Maria, you kicked off this train of thought which completely derails my plan, but that's okay. I'm interested in your thoughts about that question, the reliability of revenues. And then, Jonathan, I'd like you to pitch in because it suggests that maybe partnership structure is not the way these folks will exit. And you've already alluded to the idea that exit is the real issue, which I believe is the truth. But Maria, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts about, stability of revenue, what these companies will look like.
Thank you, Sandy. So I would like to make a clarification. The change in the organizational structure of accounting firms didn't happen only with Grant Thornton accepting private equity investment. For the audit side, there is a requirement that only CPAs can audit that side of the business. So following the private equity investment, these companies enter a so-called alternative practice structure. That means that they separate their business into the audit side and the advisory side. So there is an LLP and then there is an LLC in there. However, based on our observations and our research, what we can tell definitively that there are still very strong links between the two parts of the business. So legally they're separated, but the links are there is a dual employment of CPAs. We can see from the employment profiles of these firms that CPA partners hold board positions both in the LLP and the LLC sides of the business. There is shared employment of other personnel. There are also, we've read this in press releases and stories in the business press, management service agreements between the two parts. And management service agreements say that now the attest side of the business will pay a management fee to the advisory side of the business, and that may cover technology and all of the business support that the company gets. So this is also quite an extensive link in there. I guess the question that we cannot currently answer is how high is that fee, the structure of the fee, and what kinds of incentives and financial pressures on the assurance side that fee represents. So that is an open question, which I think John can maybe contribute more to.
Several thoughts. First, I know that the topic was prefaced with a comparison to software. A couple takeaways are, first, audit firms don't have software-type margins. And I think that is, to the extent that that this type of consolidation is levered, a software company with very wide margins has lots more room to maneuver. An accounting firm that has much narrower margins, and to the extent with increased competition they may shrink, I think that there's less room to be wrong. So I think that that's a key element of it. Another aspect of, if we were to have this conversation, not necessarily about accounting firms, but about where the private equity industry was, writ large 20 years ago, well, that was before major private equity firms focused on software. So I think when that started, it wasn't what a generalist private equity firm was doing, investing in software. There were specialists who said, we believe that there's an opportunity in software. It may be true today as it relates to business services, including accounting. So I would encourage, I think I would view a opportunity from a PE firm that was a generalist very differently than one that was presenting something to me as a co-investment, for example, that was a specialist in business services. So I think that's a really important point. Another thing that was addressed or raised was the concept of different business lines. We've seen, the steady state, accounting, the auditing, and then the ancillary services. That hasn't necessarily worked out that well and has created some frictions historically that may have led to 6 becoming 4. So I think that it's really important to understand the motivations of the private equity owner, of the management team, as firms deal with things such as succession planning, business line expansion, consolidation, as it relates to where the growth is coming from. Because once again, it gets back to the exit. To the extent a portfolio company, a private equity firm wants the highest multiple at exit, they're going to want to have the highest margin business, the fastest growth, in order to be most highly compensated.
Thank you. So in the 90s, this was, financial conglomerates took a stab at acquiring accounting firms, and it didn't work out very well. I mean, the strategy of, offering their services across their portfolio of clients didn't work. I'm interested, especially from you, Alicia, what are you worried about in terms of the strategic initiatives which may be pursued by the new owners of a firm like this? Where do you think the problems may lie?
I'd like to suggest that the PE experience in some other sectors that are similar to the accounting profession, regulated, licensed, and a requirement of who can own the assurance services, right? It's been, I think, fair to say, rather mixed in the PE world. So I'd like to think that those entities have learned from those different experiences and are going to look at how they engage with this particular sector with that benefit. So consequently, I see actually an opportunity. I'm going to disagree with Jonathan on the one point, which is the 8 to 6, the 6 to 4. I don't see that as being radically different from any other sector where the largest company wants to get larger because they can consolidate revenue, strip out costs, and become more dominant. And the sector as a whole goes to, I guess now, a quadopoly, to a triopoly, to a duopoly. I don't think that that's a high probability of happening, but if I think broadly speaking in terms of managements, think about how do you raise profitability, that is a very compelling way, especially if you can strip out costs. The problem, of course, arises that when you've got a services business, you need those people to be able to deliver the service. There's no operating leverage in making more widgets because you buy a better piece of equipment that can put out more production, right? That human being can only be in one place at any given point in time. Now, of course, with the addition of technology, perhaps with AI, as we see how this unfolding, that might change the math. But strictly speaking, a services business does have an upper limit, in my opinion, in terms of how you can expand. So that, to me, suggests that the opportunity for things going badly might be constrained. But on the other hand, I have to wonder, depending on how these entities inject funds, presumably because of the requirement, as Maria has indicated, with CPAs needing to own the assurance side of the practice, some form of capital structure change is the more likely option, right? They can own directly into the firm, et cetera, et cetera. On the advisory side, all bets are off in terms of what they can do. Now, the fact that you've got CPA partners on the board, or in many cases actually engaged in consulting engagements, depending on the nature of the client, clearly not the audit client that they're working on, well, that might present some opportunity, but it could also be problematic at the same time. So this is not to hedge an answer, but to identify the realities in terms of what I believe the PE sector is facing and trying to look at this particular sector that's clearly presenting opportunities, that has some very attractive opportunities in terms of being able to generate a return on capital or return on investment, and the realities in terms of how they might be constrained in realizing that.
So Jonathan, I've talked to people about this and characterized PE investors as aggressive investors who are driving growth, driving improved valuation, but often they do that by narrowing the margin of tolerance to risk, increasing risk and watching it far closer. One of the things that's happening is that not only are there PE equity funds coming into this industry, but private credit is also displacing other lenders to the industry. I'm just interested in your views. Do you see something different between private credit and other lenders?
Interesting question. I wasn't expecting it, so I like it.
We're going a new angle.
No, it's
you
great.
can ignore the outline, John.
In some sense, if this gets back to accounting firms looking for ways to monetize partner interests to pass an entity, growing or otherwise, to that next generation of leadership. In many ways, private credit may be more optimal, because private credit, arguably, the cost of capital is lower, and there's a kind of more narrow band of outcomes. This gets back to that book of business, the annuity-like stream associated with that attestation services. In many ways, it may be better fitting the profile of private credit than private equity, especially because you don't have to worry as much about the exit of the firm, the resale of the firm. You just have to worry about the note being repaid upon maturity. So I think in many ways it may fit private credit better.
And there is a history of these firms borrowing. I mean, there are partners who have retired over the last few decades, and invariably, these firms are borrowing. Maria, I'm interested in your observations in your early work looking at these transactions. Do you see governance changes? Are they systematic? Are they significant? How do you see governance changes in the structures of what is going on in these transactions, and do you see risk there?
So I think the truthful answer to that, we don't see that yet. Private equity, as the name implies, is private. Most of the accounting companies, all of the accounting companies are too. So unfortunately for me as a researcher, I cannot see the data points that I can analyze and reliably answer that question. What we can see are the disclosures that the company put on their websites, for example. So in terms of the governance, the things that we did notice is, again, the dual employment of partners, directors, the top management positions in both the attestation side of the business and the advisory side of the business. Because usually when people push back and they say, well, if private equity can only invest in the advisory side, how can they have an influence over the attestation side of the business? And prior research on interlocked boards actually demonstrates how that may happen. Because if we have same people sitting on the boards of the advisory business and the attestation business, and then in that same lane, we can say, well, private equity most likely invest into technology that will be implemented on both sides, because otherwise that would be an inefficient investment, for example. And if there are also shared business support functions that come into play, so all of that connects this new governance structure, which entails now two legally separate entities, but they're still very much interconnected. And I think when we read the concerns that are being expressed about private equity going into accounting, this is what it's based on. Are there potential conflicts of interest that may that private equity may impose some incentives that may be just so high to produce the returns, to increase the exit multiple for the private equity sponsor, that that will make some decisions to kind of drift into that gray area of decision making. Do we push back against the clients, maybe trying to get an opinion that they want? Or do we fire clients? Because we had this discussion, because there are two sides of that argument. We may fire clients, or we may now be more worried about the client retention in there. So yes, there are definitely changes in the governance structure, but my academic view is that more data is needed to draw definitive conclusions to that.
So I'll editorialize just briefly for the SEC and PFAR regulation. I would vote for PFAR. I know the industry may not, but I like PFAR. It's at additional disclosure by private asset owners. I think that would be helpful to your studies, Maria, and to my comfort.
I vote yes for that. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay. So, can we look at some positive examples of accounting firms that have actually undergone that? Has there been any overt evidence of positives from private equity investments? I know I shared my co-pilot summary of the media spray from New Mountain Capital on Grant Thornton. I'm interested in observations on that question. Anyone want to volunteer?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'll take that. You're not going to like my answer, unfortunately.
I'm prepared to respond.
Well, no, in all seriousness, I don't think we know a lot about the way these transactions have been structured to begin with. I think some of the way these transactions have been structured, particularly where they are credit infusions, I think it begs the question of the consideration of the assurance practice balance sheet becoming over-leveraged. And do we have to consider the possibility that they are unable to meet their obligations? I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's certainly within the realm of possibility if we think about what happened with SVB and how quickly that happened as well, right? So this is not to say that the accounting firms can't, because unfortunately, if they can't manage their capital structure, I think their clients are going to run away. They won't need to be fired.
Right.
Is definitely a risk. So, and this concept of what I'm going to characterize as pass the parcel, which is a private equity firm selling to another private equity firm, I don't know what the basis for the valuation is. It's all been internally done. It's not disclosed. We know that it's moved from one portfolio to another, and now you have to reassess the strategic relevance of that new asset in the new portfolio and how it is combining with the other aspects of it and the kind of return or cash flow generation, if that's the case, reveals itself with this new mix of entities within that. So I think it's personally early days. I feel I can sketch out opportunities and also things to start looking out for. You know, maybe the disclosure, the note disclosure to the assurance practice financial statements takes on a different complexion in terms of trying to understand how these transactions have been structured, what are the obligations, long-term or short-term, how is that going to impact it? A simple question I have is, under this APS structure, is the advisory firm generating that servicing fee based on, think about the statement of earnings, the top line, i.e. revenue, is it on an operating income basis, or is it on a net income basis, right? That would completely change the pressure on the assurance practice in terms of having to continue to make this fee across. I don't know. I don't know that this information is available, certainly not to me as a public participant.
Sounds like another vote for PFAR to me. But.
I think in many ways, Sandy, the question is, what is the case for why do this? I would say that the underwriting case, and once again, I have no knowledge of specifics of any investment. So this is what, based upon my experience, what I would perceive the underwriting case to be. And it's predicated upon the notion that as a private partnership, in many ways, the leadership of an accountancy is focused on, it's more like a bond. They're trying to maximize earnings for a period of time. To the extent a private equity firm goes in to, even though it may be a limited life, they're trying to create durable value. That durable value is predicated more upon growth beyond one's career. So how do you get that durable value? That comes from investing in technology. It comes from superior human capital management throughout the life cycle, that the pipeline of people joining the firm to middle management, to more senior management, all the way up to a board of directors. And then another dimension may be what's the product offering and where do you offer that product in terms of geography. So I would say that's probably the underwriting case. Now I can speak against every one of those, but I would say that's probably the underwriting case.
So let's respond to questions. I'm sorry I was ignoring you. Ken.
A few thoughts. One is I'm an active PE investor. I'm also an owner of one of the NBA teams. So I see this a lot. And I'm usually a very strong free market proponent, but I have some real serious concerns here. Because I think there are different conflicts. If you go think about professional sports, you have a competition between winning and making money. And many teams, all they care about is winning. I worry here that when PE comes in, they're going to think about what is winning to them, and winning to them is making more money. That may not be consistent. You know, I don't know, and by the way, I don't know how you separate accounting and auditing and consulting and all these things. I just don't know how you do it. And by the way, in leagues, the NFL just did it now. It's a 10% maximum. It has to be passive. In the NBA, it's 30%. Also has to be passive. You're not on the board. You can't have any influence. And so I don't know here what kind of influence you're going to have. Are you going to say if you don't like something going on, you want to change the head of the firm? Are you going to say you got to make more money, forget the quality controls that, yeah, I know PCAOB wants them, but we don't want you to do that. We want more money. I just don't, you know, I think I had this discussion with George last night. This is an area where I actually you can probably tell I have some strong feelings. I just don't see the resonance of what PE can provide. Yes, permanent capital perhaps, but I don't see how that's in the interest of the stakeholders here and the companies here that get audited. And so I don't know what the end game is here. And so, because as someone said, PE firms look to, they're going to look at growth, they're going to look at multiples of earnings for their exit strategy. Well, multiple of earnings means you want growth, but you also want to reduce costs. And I don't know how you can do that and still accomplish the goals here. So I'm actually pretty negative, frankly, to have PE firms invest in auditing firms. Very negative, actually.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. So the comment I will make is, Alicia, I loved your point that it is important to look at the experience of other similar sectors, and it is a very mixed experience. And what I will share with you is the experience of the healthcare sector, which has a lot of the same features. PE has now been active in the healthcare industry for a little over 15 years, actively. And what you see is that the playbook of PE is to go into an industry that is ripe for disruption, inject it with capital in order to improve processes, become more efficient. In this case, it could be technology. But one of the other important things that they will do is they will quickly identify what is high margin and what is low margin. And they will lop off that low margin component as quickly as possible. So let's fast forward 15 years into the healthcare experience. I sit on the board of a major national hospital. And what I will tell you is that to some degree, auditing and the attestation side of the business plays a very similar utility role in our industry as basic medicine does in the healthcare industry, which is that it is one of those functional utilities. Our mission is to inspire trust, right? And without the audit profession, we will not inspire that trust. But the attestation side of the business is not a high margin business. And Alicia, you're right. As a service industry, there are caps. The unit economics do not lend themselves to private equity. And that piece of the business will quickly become lopped off and severed from its high margin counterpart. And you have seen that now happening throughout the medical industry for 15 years. Fast forward to today, Moody's issued a report just 1 quarter ago that over 90% of community hospitals are on the verge of bankruptcy. And that is a concern that I have for the audit industry if you start to go far enough down that standard PE playbook. is that you will end up with an audit profession that cannot sustain itself. And where do we then go for trust? Right? So my question is, am I seeing this just simply through that perspective? Is that too damning?
I would suggest that's too damning for the simple reason of what you actually pointed out just a moment ago. We, as investors and companies, have a statutory requirement to produce those audited financial statements. I can't believe that the PE entities do not see this as the opportunity that it is. And perhaps it's my bias, but I would suggest to you that looking at the legal profession is actually a great template here. You pay those hours and you pay those fees because you need the service. It's no different here. You need that audit opinion attached to that annual report. It has to be filed within 60 days at the SEC. Where are you going to go elsewhere to do that? I cannot believe that they wouldn't see that opportunity, and that's the attractiveness in my mind at the end of the day in terms of that. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the margin side on the advisory side, but I'm actually a little bit skeptical. I'd need to see the data because, again, you can't lift your margin there. You get a larger engagement, you're going to have to put more people behind it, right? You can put more technology, you can, add some AI, whatever the case might be, but you're going to need incrementally more individuals to be able to deliver that engagement. So again, over there, I think there's an opportunity set. The other thing to keep in mind on the advisory side is that's a very crowded playing field, right? That huge growth when these firms were, tiny to non-existent 25 years ago to where they are now in terms of being in the big leagues, i.e. in the top 10 of all consulting engagements, that whole market, that pie, I don't know at what growth rate that's going to increase. So I think that's another consideration in terms of this.
On our prep call, Gina, we discussed healthcare as an example where there have been challenges because it's a regulated industry and there's a public good associated with that. And that may not be in the sweet spot of how private equity excels. One of the aspects to how you laid out your thoughts was that this has happened 15 years post. And when Sandy predicated, we won't know for 3 to 5 years, and not to quote myself, but when I said maybe the time to think about it really is the second and third generation of passing the hat, and I think that gets to your healthcare playbook, because it may not have happened in healthcare within that first generation of private equity ownership. It happened in the second and third generation if private equity life cycle is 3 to 5 years. So I agree with with that point.
So I think overall, the question is, what are the short-term consequences, what are the medium-term, and what are the long-term, right? So just jumping on John's arguments, when we say what may happen 15 years down the road, well, unfortunately, we cannot speak to that because there were no exits yet. So the investments in accounting firms are fairly recent. The earliest one that we're tracking happened in 2021 in the top 100 accounting firm. So we don't know that. In terms of the short-term things, I think the concerns that may be there is that for that first generation of private equity ownership, because the private equity backer will most probably like to increase that exit multiple quickly, they will need to grow the company quickly. And if you grow the company quickly, that may push the company beyond its ability, right, to service its clients on the proper level. Like that is, yes.
And just not a positive angle on it, but if you think about where this is likely to happen, it's unlikely that the top 4 who control 80% of the market are going to participate in this particular event or process. I just cast that aside because I know KKR does not have a $30 billion private equity financial fund targeting accounting firms. They don't have it. So there's no one out there who's in the weeds preying on the 4.
Syndicated.
Always a possibility, always a possibility. I would acknowledge that. I would acknowledge that. And in that 20% market, where mostly, my firms hire accountants. I would argue you could see systematic improvement in fees. A lot of pressure on fees in that part of the market, the 20% market. So as a PE fund runs its playbook, the early playbook will be, I'm going to see every customer's profitability. Top 20%, out. And that effect will roll through the industry. And what that effect is likely to do is to raise fees, which I think maybe the industry needs, especially in that section, the kind of the 20% of the world that isn't the big four. So this is something we'll know in either 5 or 15 years, right? And Maria has got a long-term career studying this. But.
Sandy, so we'll Paul and
Yep.
Sandy.
Oh, thanks a lot, Sandy. Great panel, really interesting. I just wanted to observe to the board that you are not innocent bystanders in this process. As Gina and Jonathan observed, private equity likes regulated sectors because cash flows are more predictable, because competition is sometimes limited or restricted. 2 examples particular to this sector would be regulation imposes burdens that encourage concentration in an industry. Right. Smaller firms can't afford to keep up with the big ones in terms of satisfying regulation. Another is regulation tends to discourage disruption. You don't want the incumbents getting disrupted by new competitors. You may make it harder for a new competitor to get into the business with a new technology or new approach. What does this mean? I don't know. I mean, you certainly, you have to regulate the industry to the goals that you have in terms of investor protection and so on. But you should probably think about the impacts of those rules and regulations on the business dynamics of the sector and how it might shape capital structures, investment structures, and so on. But really interesting. This is not going away.
That was really well said. You know, I spent my career doing like reinsurance and securitizations before I did this, and I always need a picture, right? Explain it to myself. What I find in the conversation is that no one can actually lay out for me exactly how the transaction occurred, what the current transaction looks like, so that I can understand how they exit or what happens next, right? And so you mentioned a lot of great things, the LLC, the LLP, the governing documents, the shared services, all of these sorts of things. But we're sort of operating in a world where we don't have complete transparency on that. We're not sort of, we are, right? And to me, that is very, very important. I can't tell you I'm on the PCAOB, we're talking about this. You know, we can't necessarily get the pictures. These guys need the pictures, right? And I'm more in Gina's camp than Alicia's camp on how this is going to turn out, right? Because somebody said, oh, we're so happy to have PE, it's patient capital. And I'm like, what are you talking about, right? So, you know, the conversation is really interesting, but we don't have first principles on it. We don't have the basic information to create a consistent understanding of what's actually going on. And there will be nuances to each transaction, I get it. But without that, we can't even hypothesize about the behaviors that these structures and contracts will create. And that's where they may be within the lines, but then they won't be within the lines, right? So to me, this is a great, the comment made with respect to the, you know, the audit big four are an oligopoly. This really actually shows the importance of the firm and engagement metrics It also shows the importance of firm reporting. The fact that we have to have a conversation, we're sort of guessing how the structure of these things works in a publicly regulated industry is remarkable, right? And something that without that transparency, we don't know, they don't know how to protect the public good, right? And so, you know, growing up in Nebraska, also, we see a lot of these hospitals closing in the communities because they can't make money, right? Because they've had all this PE investment, right? So I can see that and feel that. And I worry that that's going to happen here, but maybe it will create some competition or dismantle or decrease the concentration of the big four, because right now audit committees are making decisions on the auditors not based on information they have about the auditors, but on herding behavior, right? And so, you know, maybe this will create less herding behavior, but I think it gets back to, you know, I just really like a picture about how this works so I can think through all the possibilities, what the structure looks like, what the contracts are around it, and I think the PCAOB needs that.
So I think what I can respond to that are 2 points. First, I'm all for more transparency. The more transparency we have, the more data points for me, the better my career is, right? So I'm here advocating for transparency every time. Second, I think it is not entirely correct to just say, well, we are currently flying blind and we don't know anything. Because there is a robust research, right? I'm an academic, that studied the impact of private equity on the target firms, on their portfolio companies, but also we have robust research that shows that the ownership structure of the firm matters. We know what kind of consequences are possible. So I think the current concerns that are being voiced, or the upsides, because they're both, and we're trying to build a picture that's balanced, right? We want to present all points of view. We can actually build on that research, and we can make some predictions. Then, of course, we need more transparency and data to test those predictions. But yeah, we can actually speak to that. And I have and my co-authors, we have a paper where we lay out all of these things. If you're interested, I'll be happy to share that picture with you.
Thank you, Maria, for bringing up Jensen. That's the history of. Yes. Jensen's been studying this. Is he still an active academic? But he's been studying this since the late 70s.
Since the 70s.
Yeah, late 70s, and published on it regularly. And so I'm an old junk bond banker. I can tell you that a PE-owned firm that's rated under, less than investment grade has got a lower probability of default than a publicly owned, highly leveraged firm, just by history. That's just an established fact over the last 40 years. So we'll see, but you're right. No one knows, and I think that may be a good source of speculation by the panel. I think I'd like to pursue that. So Marie, you've talked about the entangling of the APS structures.
Yes.
When I think of it, I think attestation has a better value in the market than consulting, just because of the stability versus the uncertainty and volatility. Could they separate these two and operate them separately? I mean, we know they have. What are your observations there?
So my observations are that we do not see evidence that when private equity currently, in the current cycle, right, this is what we're talking about, that when they make an investment into an accounting firm, that they actually only pursue one part of the business and not the other. Because if we read the press releases, if we read the interviews, everything, and we actually look at the post-transaction structures, we can see that the firm still continues to brand it as one. There is still the same brand. There is one website. If you go to the website and you are not aware of these two legal entities behind it, what you will see, you will just see one landing page that will offer attestation services, tax services, and other advisory services. So I would say that currently, based on the transactions that we can observe, we do not see that that is the case. And in the press releases, actually, the emphasis is done on specifically saying that private equity invested into an accounting firm as a whole. There is no, and then, of course, they do this disclosure at the bottom where they say that, yes, there are now two entities.
So the industry profile is more than half of all PE-owned firms get sold to another PE firm, right? So the question will be, I guess to John, and then we'll go to you, Nemeth, is, do you see that, I mean, is KKR about to launch a, accounting firm roll-up PE fund that'll, start rolling these up?
There are, pardon me, larger and larger private equity firms focused on financial services with people out of government, for example, at the helm of these firms, and the numbers that they're raising are rather significant. So I think that there are firms that have expertise, but the one thing, I'll just go back for a second to Sandy's point that it's going to be bad because we don't know the structure. Private equity isn't transparent to begin with. We don't know the structure of just about every private equity investment out there. So I don't think that these investments are unique. I just, to just, complete the thought, I don't think that that's going to be determinative in terms of what the outcome is, the fact that we don't know what the structure is going into it.
But I would suggest that we have a very important constituent here who would be able to get access to that information via all of the firms that are registered. And it's in the PCA, I think we're making the case that it's in the PCAOB's best interest to understand how these firms are now restructuring their capital, how they're restructuring their balance sheet, and what particular risks may or may not emanate from this.
So we have Board Member Ho, Gary Walsh, and then James.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I have a question. So again, this is very interesting and emerging, and like everything, these are complex problems that are not black and white. There are, pros and cons. And, we talked about the 20% of the accounting firms that are kind of, sort of, the potential subject of private equity acquisition, and there have been a few already. One of the things that's happening in the marketplace with the auditing firms is the technology. We see the Big Four investing billions of dollars, and small firms don't have that kind of capital. And so over time, if they don't have capital infusion, one could argue that they, over time, especially when technology becomes so dominant that it affects the quality of the audit, the efficiency of the audit, that they could not exist themselves regardless. And of course, you can have the same argument about, if the private equity get them and they're just trying to run the company down to the ground and profit and exit, that's also possible. So I guess my question is, given these dilemma, and especially the concentration of the market and the technology sort of impact, what's the most constructive way to think about this area?
So no PE fund manager would come here with me, and no executive from an accounting firm would come here with me. But I have a quote from one of these PE
Sorry, when you
funds.
said no PE would, just so I couldn't.
They wouldn't come and talk about this
here,
in public.
wouldn't come here,
They wouldn't
okay.
do it, wouldn't do it. We talked to a lot. But I got a very excellent, simple quote from one of them who said it's a very simple strategy. It's a focus in this order: talent, technology, leading to growth. And he went on to say, yeah, we're often replacing senior partners who are leaving. We have to reshuffle our talent flow because it has been abruptly disturbed somehow. Don't know why, but accounting doesn't seem to be the hot topic at universities at the moment. And technology is a looming risk to every company that they are looking at. Looming, I think you put it well. If they cannot compete, if they don't have the capability, they may not be under consideration anymore. So, yeah, I'm quoting him. It's not my talent, technology, growth, in that order.
Yeah, and also a follow-up question on that, especially you mentioned Grant Thornton. Prior to the private equity infusion, their advisory business is larger than the attestation business. So in that kind of structure, how is that any different from the concern that private equity firm present as the panelists discussed earlier?
Well, it's a numerator-denominator issue potentially, right? If we notice that audit assurance fees have been declining, that's immediately going to change the proportion because we know the phenomenal growth that the advisory businesses have generated. We know that the dynamic between those two is very different as well. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess the reason I asked that question is because we're talking about, when the private equity in their structure that there is legal separation, and then but in reality they're the same, and then that the implication is that there's influence that they can have on the attestation business, and maybe the interest is to maximize growth or potentially cut corners. And I guess I'm just asking how that is any different for a firm that has a much larger advisory revenue than the attestation revenue. Wouldn't the same thing happen without even any private equity infusion?
But there's one important there's one important factor in my mind to consider here, and that is the revealed deficiencies on the assurance practice, right? So I don't know that we've seen the full implications of how these firms, because I don't think this is something that they're going to be able to address in a very short period of time. So that is yet to reveal itself. And I'm wondering whether the private equity involvement is seeing this as an opportunity to bring things not just up to standard, but use that as a basis to tip that balance between percent of assurance fees versus percent of advisory. So that's what I meant by numerator denominator, in terms of, yes, statically right now, as a point in time, that's what it looks like. But is that a guarantee that it's going to look that way going forward, given the dynamics in the assurance, the advisory side of the business as we see it right now? I think the jury's out on that yet.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think what I'm asking is that if you think private equity in the scenario that their infusion coming in could potentially influence the sort of the assurance business, I'm just asking in firms that currently, if their advisory revenue is more than the assurance already, how is that different?
So I think one of the interesting things, I did a media survey of information about Grant Thornton. Be happy to share it with anyone. We shared it on the panel and we've talked about it. I didn't detect any specific strategic differentiation between those two separate businesses for Grant Thornton in their media and press releases, right? I would suggest that I would expect a PE buyer would evaluate those two businesses separately and value one differently than the other, right? So attestation, less volatility, more predictability, consulting, less predictable and coming off a pandemic high. Actually, we're seeing some of these consultants releasing people because they're coming off the pandemic high of consulting revenues. So, you're asking to look behind behind the curtain of how they made that decision and then how they expect their strategy to be implemented. And I think that'll be something we have to watch. You know, what will be their strategy, and at the margin, if their strategy isn't working, I think a lot of the risks that Gina points out and Sandy pointed out, where, okay, our strategy isn't working, we need to make sure EBITDA keeps going up. If we can't do it through revenue, we do it through expense management, right? So these are all, 8 to 15 years, like John said.
One way to answer the question, and I'll contradict what I just said before, is that the answer might be leverage or be tied up in leverage to the extent a firm, has a big consultancy-driven business on Y2K consulting. If we were to go back in time, then that disappears, and they're valued on that consulting, and then they, once again, the underwriting, wouldn't all be predicated upon that. But I think that the degrees of freedom in terms of operating the different sides of the house, of the business, may be somewhat curtailed based upon the amount of leverage the underlying entity has, and that may cause them to prospectively shift their business such that they don't breach a bond covenant.
So actually, one question which I don't know, who is responsible for reviewing the ownership structures and capital structures of the accounting firms? For example, if I use the example I used before of leagues, the league has to approve all the ownership structures, board of governors, and so it's very clear if someone wants to, how much anyone can own, who can be passive, active. So who's going to review PwC and says, geez, you have enough capital to manage your business? Who decides how much debt or leverage they can add? Who decides this? I actually don't know.
No one. It sounds like another vote for PFAR, to be honest. I mean, so that's one of the fascinating things. So we were going to end up with a conversation about, okay, we don't really know what's going to happen. We kind of think we know what PE's historic strategies have been. We know that they are now into this industry and pursuing it. So what does an auditor of an audit, the PCAOB, need to think about in terms of, okay, what questions do we now have to add to our book of due diligence checklist, right? It's going to, starting to talk about governance and talk about influence and talk about, I think it'll be a fascinating transition for the auditors of auditors of audits, to start asking these questions, because if there is no voluntary transparency, there has to be, you have to extract that information to look for indicators, right? I mean, and maybe there are indicators in the data set historically, because there have been accounting firms that have failed and flamed out. So there may be indicators already, but it could be some new training for auditors of audits. Yeah, and that, I think that's worthy of a conversation. What would that look like? How will that change their approach? And these will be a unique set. This is not going to be a full industry. It'll be a unique set. You may end up having a team of PE-owned audit firm, gorilla team, to attack this question.
Ken, I actually took a peek to try and get to that. And from what I could find, the AICPA has guidance on how to structure the firm. So
I love that term. I love that term, guidance.
Well, it's not a standard, right?
Yeah,
that's one of the key differences.
What happens if you don't do as the guidance suggests?
Well,
what are the consequences?
State regulators, yeah, but it's not clear what kind of authority they have.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but that issue around only CPAs can be owners of a CPA firm, right? Because that's a licensed function. So you can't have someone who doesn't have a CPA license signing off on financial statements. So that becomes sort of, that's where the guidance gets teeth, so to speak. But in my opinion, the note disclosure is going to get really important. The problem is that I don't have access to the financial statements for any of these firms. But we have some parties that do, who could shed some light on what's going on. Because it is going to take, in my opinion, some legwork to go through the note disclosure and make the determination of what's going on, and then tie to the balance sheet side, the statement of financial position side of what's happening.
Thank you, Alicia. So Gary, you're next. It's on Nemeth's card, and James.
This is the problem with not getting your card up fast enough. Most of the good things have already been said. But I was going to talk about how I don't worry at all about the PE firms and their ability to make money at this. We shouldn't lose sleep over the PE firms. They're going to do just fine. But from a consumer standpoint, I'm really worried. The same way I would worry about, well, my car wash was recently taken over by PE. Dental practices worry me. And I think from a consumer, there's a lack of quality that typically go hand in hand occasionally with PE involvement because of the short-circuiting of the profit cycle. But I think what this also highlights is the deficiencies in the accounting industry structure that we've talked about. And I thought Jonathan did a good job of talking about the underwriting case. We could see better implementation of technology investment. We could see better talent training. Those are deficiencies that we clearly have currently. I'd add succession planning is enhanced by the participation of a steady state of steady source of capital. Also, I think the past we've seen problems with accounting firms as big as Arthur Andersen that suffered because of the lack of retained earnings, and clearly there would be a better stable source of capital. As we look at the structure of the accounting firms currently, 20% of these firms are the targets. That's also the same 20% that are really having trouble with quality. When you look at the deficiencies, no one's covering themselves in glory in terms of quality, but beyond the big four, it's much worse. And so I think that we should consider the margins of the current firms, and if we can't rely on these firms to continue to be able to just accept unprofitable business. Why are they doing the unprofitable business and these PE firms won't is a good question, and I think we need to do more to support better fees and better pricing with the business that is currently being conducted.
So this question is for Maria. In a paper you wrote, you specifically pointed out that there may be diminished audit quality. And so what were your concerns there? What did you find? And what are your thoughts now?
I would like to clarify, we did not use that word because we are trying to give a very balanced view of what may or may not happen. The paper that you're referring to, it was at the proposal stage, and we haven't had the opportunity to analyze the data in terms of the audit quality outcomes yet. But what I can say, because I think that our discussion here is kind of drifting towards the negative outcomes of private equity going into accounting profession, we did run the first test where we wanted to see the market perceptions when the transaction is announced that private equity invested into the auditor. We look at the market reactions to the client firms of this auditor. And the market reaction is overall positive and significant. So it seems like despite all of the concerns that were voiced here, the markets overall, on average, right, they perceive this as good news. So I think that kind of presents a point of view that tells us we should not overgeneralize specific examples. We should take a step back and kind of look at the large sample evidence, which we are trying to do. And I'm looking forward for an opportunity once we have those tests to actually come and present them here. But I cannot speak to that yet.
May I add just that I was actually struck by that observation as well, so I was trying to think of why that would be. And to me, the one important difference between the dental firms being, the dental practices being consolidated, or with the hospital situation, or with each of the customers of those businesses are individuals. And their ability to be able to push back and make demands, I think, are far, far more limited than the clients of audit firms. They've got deeper pockets. They've got a vested interest in not having these, I would say, at least as an audit committee chair, I worry when I see the trend from the PCAOB data or from the CPAB data around the deficiencies. And now I'm wondering, well, who should we be hiring if they're all experiencing these kinds of issues, right? Something's, at least to me, says something's wrong in terms of the way in which things are operating. And I can't help but believe that companies should already be pushing back. As an audit committee chair, I will tell you, I'm pushing back in terms of making demands around, how do I know that this is not impacting? When I'm here reading about all these various things in the financial press about, quite frankly, the egregious nature of the issues within some of these firms, right? So there are much deeper pockets of the entities that can push back relative to healthcare and some of these other sectors that we have talked about.
Thank you, Alicia. So I saw Nemit's caught up, and then George.
Well, much of what I wanted to ask actually, I think, has come up. The main thing is that I hear a lot of negativity about PE investments, which I understand and I get, and a lot of it relates to PE firms, their investments basically spilling over to the audit side. And I think to me it would help if there's greater clarity of whether there can be guardrails set up such that the consequences of PE investments in the consulting side does not affect the audit side, and maybe there is not. The other part was just is there a positive in the sense that, a big issue in the audit industry right now is the ability to attract talent, and to the extent these PE investments allow for greater exit opportunities, better growth for people on the audit side, does that actually lead to a better pipeline of people coming in? And again, these are questions. I don't know if this is possible or not. Yeah.
I think it is definitely possible, and circling back to the chairwoman's comment there about the technology and the fact that Big Four is currently investing billions of dollars into that, I can say the big positive for everyone that is not Big Four is the private equity coming into the company and actually providing capital and that opportunity to grow that technology side of the business. So again, I see the positives there as well, because if we are careful in structuring and observing these transactions, I believe that there is good in that. It's not necessarily just doom and gloom, like Gina said. Which I also share. I share your point of view in there. There can be positives, there can be negatives, but I do share Nemit's spirit here in terms of we should not just look at this from one side. There are positives. There is tech investment. There is obviously a workforce investment in there, because this was also mentioned in this panel. Universities are currently struggling recruiting students to be accounting majors. And I teach intermediate accounting, which is the first stepping stone into going into this profession. And yes, it's incredibly challenging, and compensation is one of those things. So I believe that private equity firms, when they come in, they may change the incentives and the compensation structures in a positive way, which will, again, develop more companies and more professionals and just this industry in general.
Great, thank you. This has been a great panel. We could probably spend the next 3 days, and the more we talk, the more questions come to mind. But I'm just curious, maybe quickly, and you're thinking about, we've touched on parts of this, but thinking about the culture of the firm, the culture of the existing firm, and that's something we're focused on, and I think other regulators are focused on. Culture seems to play a much outsized factor at the end of the day in terms of audit quality. And I'm thinking about a line partner or a line manager or a line second-year staff, and this transaction happens, and what that means for them, and what nuances or what unwritten rules start to shift, maybe not on day one, but saying, as you said, this movie will play out for a while probably, for better or for worse. And I'm just thinking about what that means for me and how I think about asking one more question. Do I ask that one more question thinking I may spend more hours and that may impact the margin? Or is technology going to be forced on us in ways because it's going to reduce the headcount needed so then margins increase over time? And I don't know the answer to that, but I'm just curious if you all were thinking about what that means for that staff accountant, line partner that's trying to do the best they can for audit quality for the capital markets, but now their motivations or incentives may start to shift on them.
I think it's one of many unknowns, but I would argue that if I was a motivated, eager line staff person, I would find it exciting that, my small firm is going to grow. I have career prospects that I might not otherwise have because I'm not at a big four firm. I'm at the other 20%, but, hey, I may now have equity in what may be the next thing. So I would say that may be true also of a high-performing, more senior person to the extent you are a senior person that may not be the most high-performing, then maybe there's cause for concern, but that may be good in terms of the culture and good for the industry, more, writ large.
Tara? This is sort of a follow-up to that. We're not talking about the end of the pipeline and the fact that these are partnerships and that a lot of the firms have mandatory retirement ages and they pay out pensions, effectively. I'd love to hear the panel's thoughts on that, as well.
That could be what's driving some of this, right? Senior partners whose pension is not fully funded. I mean, that's speculation on my part, but.
But we could turn that into data analytics by, with all of these smaller firms that are being absorbed to create a larger firm, I'd be interested in knowing what the new number of partners is. That's going to give you a pretty good indicator of how many partners have left in that short period of time versus what they had originally. And I have a similar opinion, which is I think this is the exit strategy for many of these small firms, because if they don't have someone who can come in and take over this practice, i.e. their children or someone that they can sell this practice to, how do you monetize this client book, right? It's the same problem that a financial advisor has when they're retiring. So they want to be part of a larger organization who can essentially pay them out on the expected annuity of fees that can be generated from that book.
But is there anything wrong with that?
No. But I think it raises the question of exit, right? So if you're BDO and you're borrowing from private credit, you're borrowing with an expectation you're going to pay them back, right? Because that's what the private credit guy screened you for. He wanted to see your business model. He wanted to see your projections. He's going to watch it quarterly, and he's going to make sure he's getting paid out, and he's got covenants to protect him if he's not. Once you're an equity stakeholder, like 60% of an accounting firm, the exit becomes the question. And then that gets complicated because if you're a partnership and you're paying out your capital and there's no retained earnings, it complicates the valuation. It complicates who could buy you. You probably can't go public. Is there another PE firm? And I'm sure that any investor in an accounting firm today who's a PE fund, the first question they have to ask at their committee is, what happens in 8 years? You tell me where you want to build your strategy, but what happens in 8 years? What's our exit? Because they have no choice. they must exit. These are life-limited funds. And that's why I think it'll be so interesting over the next 8 to 15 years. That could be a cap on the number of transactions you see. You know, you may not see a wave of these. You may have seen the wave crest already if they can't defend that question at the committee, right? It'll be interesting to watch.
Here's a cynical take on the BDO part of the comment, and that is, I found it very curious that all of the press releases talked about some degree of reinvesting in these firms, right? Whether it was technology or bringing in talent, et cetera. Because if they didn't talk about that and all of the funds were going to pay out retiring partners, where's the future growth? There's no future growth, essentially, exactly. So there has to be some degree of reinvestment. You know, I think these people are very bright. Jonathan is very bright. So they're thinking a lot of these things through in terms of, no, I don't mean that in a trite manner. What I'm trying to say is that they've got a particular framework, they've got a particular objective and an outcome, they've got constraints in terms of what exit options are available to them, but in the interim, they have to generate a return on capital.
Right.
And you can only dividend so much out in a services firm. In a manufacturing facility, absolutely. Replace the human beings. You get your robot working 24 hours. You can ramp up production, you know, simplistically in a very meaningful way.
And just realize that's not different from the typical PE fund investment. The money all goes to the shareholders or the old equity owners. And the PE fund who ends up owning the company also has that problem. Is there enough cash flow coming up to keep investing? Do I have to put more in? So it's not a complete change in their profile, right?
Language is about growth, but you know, the people who are making the decision are the more senior people who are going to get more of the payout, right? The verbiage that comes out has to say that, because I mean, as somebody who worked at KPMG and was the senior manager when they sold Beringport and got nothing, right? Versus the partners, right? So that is about the posture of it, and those junior people don't have any more insight into the structure than you or I do, right?
But maybe some of those junior people are thinking, here's some real opportunity because that layer is exiting. I've got a clearer path to perhaps shape this firm a little bit differently. I don't know, but that is a possibility in terms of that opportunity set. Because if that layer remains, there is none. But, you know, and Maria, perhaps Maria can speak about this in the academic world, right?
Yeah.
You've got this large pool of professors who continue to be there, which means they're occupying a seat, and therefore the ability for someone with a PhD to come up and, you know, move through the ranks and land that position, et cetera, is really limited. No?
It's a really rose-colored
As a
glasses.
tenure-track professor, I think I would say no comment on that.
And to look at the playbook of many PE funds, part of that playbook is often to distribute equity at lower levels of the operation to counter the cultural impacts of, you know, all the money just disappeared with the, you know, the three guys at the top, right? So.
Well, this has been remarkable, truly remarkable. So thank you, John. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Sandy. And thank you, Maria, for doing it. We'll break for lunch. It's in the same area where breakfast was served. Please be back at 1:30 sharp for your ethics briefings. This is for the members of the IG, not the panelists, outside panelists. We'll see you at 1:30 here, and then we'll begin the public meeting at 2.